My son sent me a text on Christmas Eve. It read, "Dad, it would be better if you did not come for Christmas this year. We need space as a family." I read those words while staring at a $500 spa charge his wife had just put on my credit card an hour prior. I did the math. $500,000 a year. That is what their space cost me. I sat down, opened my banking app, and canceled everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful family member a hard, unforgettable lesson. My name is Wesley Carmichael. I am 69 years old, and what I am about to tell you will change how you look at the people you sacrifice everything for. I was sitting at my worn oak dining table in my small brick house on the south side of Chicago. I had just finished wrapping a dollhouse for my granddaughter Lily. My hands, calloused from decades of hard work, carefully folded the bright red paper. The house smelled of pine and the sweet potato pie I had been preparing for the past 2 days. That is when my phone buzzed on the table. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked it up, expecting to see a message from Aaron asking what time I would be arriving the next day. Instead, I saw those cold, calculating words. "Dad, it would be better if you did not come for Christmas this year. Courtney and I feel we need space as a family. We want to establish our own traditions. Do not take it personally. Merry Christmas." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Do not take it personally. How could a father not take it personally when his only son uninvites him to Christmas via a text message? I had spent the last 5 years since my wife passed away doing nothing but ensuring Aaron and his family never lacked a single thing, and this was my reward. Space. They wanted space from the old black man who drove a battered Ford pickup. I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, the silence suddenly feeling incredibly heavy. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and opened the banking application on my phone. The screen loaded, displaying the shared accounts I had set up to help them out when Aaron supposedly hit a rough patch. Right at the top of the transaction list, glowing like a neon sign of disrespect, was a pending charge for $500 at the Lotus Retreat, the most exclusive luxury spa in their wealthy white suburb. The timestamp showed the transaction happened exactly 1 hour ago. Courtney was getting a hot stone massage on my dime while dictating the text message to banish me from their home. I put my phone down and rubbed my temples. I started doing the mental math, something I had avoided for years out of blind parental love. $15,000 a month for the mortgage on their sprawling suburban mansion. $4,000 a month for the leases on her Porsche and his Mercedes. Another $40,000 a year for Lily's elite private school tuition. Then there were the credit cards. The designer clothes, the country club fees, the fine dining, the extravagant vacations to places I was never invited to. It added up to nearly $500,000 a year. $500,000. That was the price tag of their fake aristocratic lifestyle. To Aaron and Courtney, I was just a retired, grieving widower scraping by on a pension. That is the image I portrayed. They thought the money came from a modest life insurance policy my wife left behind, slowly draining away. They had no idea that beneath my faded flannel shirts and scuffed work boots, I owned a massive portfolio of commercial real estate and a chain of logistics warehouses across Chicago. I was a multimillionaire many times over. I lived in this small house because it held the memories of my late wife, not because it was all I could afford. I kept my wealth hidden so my son would learn the value of hard work. But my silence had only bred entitlement. Courtney despised my humble appearance, constantly throwing microaggressions my way, embarrassed by her working-class black father-in-law in front of her elite friends. She wanted my money, but she did not want me. A cold, hard clarity washed over me. The grief and the sting of rejection evaporated, replaced by an absolute icy resolve. They wanted space. I was going to give them the vast, empty, terrifying space of the real world. I picked up my phone again, but this time my fingers did not tremble. I navigated to the control panel of my master accounts. First, I found the autopay setup for their $3 million mansion. I clicked cancel. A small prompt asked if I was sure. I did not hesitate. Yes. Next, I moved to the vehicle leases. The Porsche and the Mercedes. Cancel, cancel. I felt a strange sense of liberation with every tap of the screen. I went into the credit card management portal. I selected Courtney's Platinum Supplementary Card. Deactivate immediately. Reason for deactivation. I typed in 2 words. Account closed. I did the same for Aaron's card. Then I opened the portal for Lily's private academy. I navigated to the tuition payment schedule. I loved my granddaughter dearly, But her mother was using her as a status symbol, and the school was just another bill I was silently footing. I stopped the upcoming spring semester payment. I did not stop there. I called my private wealth manager a sharp man who had managed my portfolio for over a decade. He answered on the second ring despite it being Christmas Eve. I gave him a single, definitive order. Freeze every joint asset connected to Aaron Carmichael. Sever all financial lifelines. If a single cent of my money moves toward that suburb tomorrow, you are fired. He did not ask questions. He simply said, "Consider it done, Mr. Carmichael." I hung up the phone and set it face down on the table. The sweet potato pie was still cooling on the rack. The wrapped dollhouse sat quietly in the corner. I walked over to the trash can, picked up the bright red package, and gently set it aside for a local charity drive. Then I poured myself a glass of bourbon. I sat in my favorite armchair, listening to the crackle of the radiator. I was not angry anymore. I was simply a businessman who had just terminated a very bad investment. For 2 hours, the house was perfectly peaceful. I sipped my bourbon and watched the snow begin to fall outside my living room window, blanketing the south side streets in quiet white. I imagined Courtney at the spa, oblivious, sipping cucumber water. I imagined Aaron sitting in his lavish living room, feeling proud that he had successfully set a boundary with his embarrassing old father. Then the silence shattered. My phone violently vibrated against the wooden table, the buzzing sound harsh and frantic. The screen lit up with a picture of Aaron. I let it ring. It stopped, then immediately started again. This time a text message flashed across the screen. "Dad, please pick up. Something is wrong with the bank. Courtney's card was declined at the salon and the bank is saying the mortgage payment bounced. Please call me back right now. It is an emergency." I took a slow sip of my drink, savoring the warmth in my chest. The space they asked for had officially arrived. I let the phone buzz a third time before I finally swiped the green icon to accept the call. I did not say hello. I just brought the receiver to my ear and listened. Aaron was not breathing normally. He was panting, his voice pitched high with a frantic, suffocating panic. "Dad, finally. Listen, I need you to call the private banking line right now. Tell them to lift the fraud lock. They are humiliating me." I sat back in my armchair and took another slow sip of my bourbon. "Fraud lock?" I asked, my tone completely flat. "Where exactly are you, Aaron? I thought you were spending a quiet Christmas at the house." There was a brief, guilty hesitation on the other end of the line. "We are in Aspen." He blurted out the words, rushing together in a desperate stream. "We flew out this morning right after Courtney's spa appointment. We are at the front desk of the St. Regis Resort, and the clerk just declined the platinum card for the $12,000 incidental hold. He ran it 3 times, Dad. 3 times. The lobby is packed with people we know from the country club. The manager is looking at me like I am a criminal. They are threatening to cancel our luxury ski package and give our suite to someone else. You have to fix this immediately. Call the bank and authorize the charges. It must be a security flag because of the out-of-state location. Tell them it is me." Aaron was practically begging, his usual arrogant corporate demeanor completely shattered. He was hyperventilating over the prospect of public embarrassment in front of the exact demographic he spent his entire life trying to impress. Through the receiver, beneath the sound of Aaron's frantic breathing, I could hear a shrill, hysterical voice echoing in the background. It was Courtney. She was not at the front desk with her husband. She was a few yards away in one of the high-end designer boutiques located within the resort lobby, and she was causing an absolute scene. I could hear her screaming at a sales associate because her supplementary card had just been rejected for a $5,000 limited edition handbag. She was throwing a massive tantrum, shouting that she was a VIP, that her husband was a financial executive, and that their machine was obviously broken. Hearing her melt down over a purse painted a perfect, pathetic picture of her entire existence. Courtney was a woman utterly consumed by her obsession with white elite status. She had married my son, but she spent every waking moment trying to erase his heritage and distance herself from his roots. She actively hid me from her ultra-wealthy social circle, terrified that her country club friends would discover her father-in-law was a working-class, presenting black man from the south side of Chicago. She leveraged my secret wealth to construct a flawless, aristocratic facade playing the role of a generational trust fund heiress. She used my money to buy proximity to whiteness, exclusivity, and extreme wealth. Every luxury car, every private school gala, every designer outfit was carefully curated to ensure she fit in with the billionaires of her suburban neighborhood. And now the very foundation of her meticulously crafted identity was crumbling in the middle of a crowded luxury resort lobby. Without my invisible financial net holding her up, she was just a woman screaming at a retail worker over a piece of leather she could not actually afford. I listened to her screeching in the background, demanding to speak to a manager, demanding that someone respect her status. It was a status bought and paid for by the sweat of the same old black man she had just deemed unworthy of a Christmas dinner invitation. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering, but it only solidified the absolute certainty in my chest. The free ride was permanently over. Aaron got back on the phone, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper as he tried to hide his panic from the wealthy guests passing by. "Dad, are you listening to me? Courtney is losing her mind over there. The concierge is waiting. You need to call the private client line and clear this up. Just tell them to push the authorizations through. Do it now, please." I did not move from my chair. I watched the snow falling gently on my front lawn, feeling a profound sense of peace. I spoke with absolute, unwavering calm. "There is no fraud lock, Aaron. There is no bank error." Aaron stopped breathing for a second. "What do you mean there is no error?" "The card is declining. The account says it is frozen." I took a deep breath and delivered the reality check he had needed for the last 15 years. "The account is not frozen. The account is closed. I canceled the platinum cards. I canceled the auto pay for your mortgage. I canceled the leases on the luxury vehicles. I even canceled the upcoming tuition payment for Lily's academy. The money is gone, Aaron. All of it." A suffocating silence stretched over the phone line. When Aaron finally spoke, his voice cracked, completely devoid of his usual arrogance. "Closed. Why would you close the accounts?" "What are you talking about? You cannot do this. We are stranded in Aspen. We have no other way to pay for this." I kept my voice cold and steady, slicing through his panic with surgical precision. "You sent me a text message 2 hours ago, Aaron. You said it would be better if I did not come for Christmas. You said you and Courtney needed space as a family. You said you wanted to establish your own traditions. I am simply respecting your boundaries. I am giving you the space you so desperately requested. My money and my presence come as a package deal. Since I am no longer welcome at your holiday table, my wallet is no longer available to fund your holiday vacations. You are a 38-year-old financial executive. Figure out how to pay your own bills, establish your own traditions, but do not ever expect me to bankroll the lifestyle of a family that treats me like an embarrassing secret." Aaron began to stammer, his panic morphing into sheer terror. "Dad, wait. You misunderstood the text. Courtney was just stressed. We did not mean it like that. You cannot just cut us off in the middle of Colorado. We will be thrown out onto the street." I let his desperate pleas wash over me without a single ounce of pity. "You wanted independence, Aaron. Congratulations. You have it. I strongly suggest you pack your bags and head to the airport while you still have enough miles to book a flight home." Before Aaron could utter another pathetic excuse, there was a violent scuffle on the other end of the line. Courtney snatched the phone from his hands. The polite, strained facade she usually wore around me vanished entirely. She exploded, her voice dripping with venom and racial microaggressions. "Listen to me, you bitter ghetto old man. You are not going to ruin our perfect family Christmas because of your petty insecurities. Turn those cards back on right now, or I swear to God you will never see your granddaughter again. I will make sure Lily forgets you even exist. Do you hear me?" I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply pressed the red button and ended the call. I set the phone face down on the table, silencing her toxic threats. I picked up my landline and dialed a number I knew by heart. It was Oliver Price, my ruthless corporate attorney. He answered immediately. "Oliver," I said, my voice like steel, "initiate the reclamation protocol. Destroy everything." The flight back from Aspen was a masterclass in silent fury. Aaron and Courtney had been unceremoniously escorted out of the St. Regis by hotel security after their third credit card was declined at the front desk. They had to spend the last of Aaron's emergency cash on 2 coach tickets back to Chicago, sitting in cramped middle seats while Courtney refused to speak to him. It took them less than 24 hours to go from rubbing elbows with billionaires in the snowy mountains to dragging their heavy luggage through the slush of their own driveway. The picturesque $3 million suburban mansion loomed in the distance, a sprawling limestone estate that Courtney treated as her absolute personal kingdom. Usually arriving home was her favorite part of any trip, a chance to wave at the equally wealthy neighbors and pretend her life was perfect. Today, she just wanted to hide inside and scream at her husband until he fixed the massive financial mess his father had caused. Aaron dragged the heavy suitcases up the heated front walkway, exhausted, freezing, and thoroughly humiliated. He dreaded the argument that was about to happen once they crossed the threshold. As they reached the towering mahogany front doors, Courtney stopped dead in her tracks, dropping her expensive tote bag onto the wet pavement. Taped directly over the heavy brass handle was a thick, legal-sized envelope. It was sealed with bright red tape bearing the official crest of a highly prominent Chicago law firm. Aaron felt his stomach drop all the way to his feet. Legal notices taped to doors in this ultra-exclusive neighborhood were the ultimate social death sentence. Someone could have seen it. A neighbor could have taken a picture. Courtney snatched the envelope off the wood, her manicured fingers trembling with unadulterated rage. She tore the heavy paper open right there on the porch, unable to wait until they were safely inside the foyer. Aaron stared at the legal document in his wife's shaking hands, a cold, suffocating dread washing over his entire body. To the outside world, and specifically to Courtney's elite circle of country club friends, Aaron Carmichael was a self-made financial genius. He constantly boasted about his brilliant investment strategies and his rapid climb up the corporate ladder. But that entire persona was a carefully constructed fiction. The reality was that exactly 5 years ago, Aaron had completely bankrupted himself trying to fund Courtney's insatiable appetite for designer brands, luxury cars, and exotic vacations. He had maxed out every single line of credit, leveraged his modest starter home to the breaking point, and eventually faced total financial ruin. When the creditors came knocking and Courtney threatened to leave him over the impending poverty, Aaron had crawled to my doorstep in the South Side, weeping and begging for salvation. I did not just bail him out. I bought them a completely fresh start. I used one of my anonymous commercial shell companies, a corporate entity named Horizon Estate Holdings, to purchase the massive $3 million limestone mansion outright in pure cash. I allowed Aaron and Courtney to move in, immediately maintaining the absolute illusion that Aaron had purchased the property himself. The deed was entirely in my company's name, but I drafted a private, legally binding lease agreement naming Aaron as the sole tenant. The monthly rent was set at $15,000, a massive sum I secretly waived every single month, essentially allowing them to live in a mansion entirely rent-free. Courtney threw lavish dinner parties, bragging endlessly about her husband's real estate acumen, entirely oblivious to the fact that her glamorous life was subsidized by the very man she actively excluded from her social events. The lease had one strict stipulation hidden deep in the fine print. The owner reserved the right to demand all waived-back rent immediately upon any breach of contract or simply evict the tenant with a standard 30-day notice. For 5 years, I let that contract gather dust in Oliver Price's secure filing cabinet. I was a father protecting his son's fragile ego, but Aaron had shattered that protection the moment he sent that text message. The safety net was gone, and the brutal reality of their situation was staring them right in the face. Courtney's eyes scanned the heavy legal document, her face turning a sickly shade of gray in the winter light. "It is an eviction notice," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the harsh wind whipping across the driveway. Aaron snatched the paper from her hands, his eyes darting frantically across the page. The bold black letters at the top left no room for misinterpretation. Notice to vacate. The document formally stated that the tenant Aaron Carmichael was in severe violation of the lease agreement with Horizon Estate Holdings. It demanded the immediate vacation of the premises within 30 days due to massive non-payment of rent. Furthermore, a secondary document attached underneath outlined a ruthless demand for the immediate payment of the waived rent from the past 60 months. The total came to exactly $900,000. Aaron felt his knees physically buckle. He had to lean against the stone pillar to keep from collapsing. The legal weight of Oliver Price's meticulous paperwork was crushing him. He knew exactly what this meant. Horizon Estate Holdings was me. I was legally stripping him of the house and dropping $1 million anchor on his chest. Courtney finally found her voice, and it was a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed across the quiet suburban street. "What does this mean, Aaron? Who the hell is Horizon Estate Holdings? Why are we getting an eviction notice for a house you own? You told me you bought this place." Aaron backed away, clutching the paper to his chest, completely unable to meet her furious, demanding gaze. "I did not buy it." He stammered, the massive lie he had protected for 5 years finally unraveling on his own front porch. "My dad bought it. He owns the holding company. He lets us live here for free. I just pay the property taxes. Courtney looked at him as if he had just grown a second head. She stepped forward and shoved him hard in the chest, her face contorted with disgust. Your dad, the man who drives a beat-up truck and lives in a brick shack, owns this mansion. You lied to me for 5 years. You made me think we were owners, and we are just charity cases for a ghetto old man. Her rage was absolute. The humiliation of being exposed as a fraud, combined with the fact that her hated father-in-law held the deed to her entire life, pushed her over the edge. We have 30 days, Aaron gasped, completely ignoring her insults and staring at the legal demand. 30 days to pack up a 10,000-square-foot house. And he is demanding almost $1 million. He is going to ruin us. Courtney snatched the legal notice right back out of his hands, tearing it in half and throwing the pieces violently into the snow. No, she screamed, her face flushed with unhinged, desperate fury. We are not packing anything. He cannot do this to us. I will not let some bitter, pathetic old man kick me out of my own home and humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood. Get in the car right now, Aaron. Aaron hesitated, terrified of the forces he had already unleashed, but Courtney was already marching aggressively toward the driveway. Get in the car, she ordered, pointing at his sedan. We are going straight to the south side. We are going to force that senile old fool to tear up this eviction notice and sign the deed over to us immediately. He is going to fix this, or I am going to make his life a living hell. Aaron scrambled into the passenger seat without another word. The engine roared to life and they sped out of the wealthy suburb. Barreling straight toward my front door for a confrontation they were entirely unprepared to win. I was pouring a second glass of bourbon when the violent pounding started. Before I could even stand up, the front door flew open. Courtney stormed into my living room, bringing a gust of freezing Chicago wind and the bitter stench of her entitlement. She did not bother to wipe her designer boots, tracking dirty slush across the hardwood floors my late wife used to polish by hand. Aaron trailed behind her, looking like a scolded child. Courtney looked around my modest living room with an expression of pure revulsion, her nose wrinkled as if the very air in my house was toxic. She loudly declared that she could not believe she had to lower herself to come to this ghetto neighborhood, complaining that her car was probably being stripped for parts as we spoke. She crossed her arms, her diamond rings catching the dim light of my reading lamp, and launched right into her attack. She demanded to know what kind of sick, twisted joke I was playing. She screamed that I had no right to send thugs to stick eviction notices on her front door, embarrassing her in front of her neighbors. I remained completely seated in my armchair. I took a sip of my drink and looked at the two of them. The contrast was striking. Aaron, the supposed financial mastermind, was trembling in his expensive cashmere coat, while his wife stood there barking orders in a house she had deemed too far beneath her to visit for the past 3 years. I calmly set my glass down and told her to lower her voice in my home. She scoffed, stepping closer and raising her voice even louder, demanding I fix the mess I had made. Courtney leaned over my coffee table, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. She shouted that the mansion belonged to them. She claimed Aaron had earned that house through his brilliant investments and late nights at the financial firm, and that some jealous, bitter old man was not going to take it away. She was absolutely convinced that Aaron was the primary financial provider and I was just an ungrateful squatter clinging to their orbit. I looked at Aaron. He refused to meet my eyes, staring intensely at the floorboards, his silence speaking volumes. I stood up slowly, walked over to the wooden credenza against the wall, and unlocked the bottom drawer. I pulled out a thick black leather folder that Oliver Price had prepared for me years ago. I walked back and dropped it heavily onto the coffee table right in front of Courtney. I told her that her husband had not earned a single brick of that limestone mansion. I explained that exactly 5 years ago. While she was busy planning her third luxury vacation to the Maldives, Aaron was drowning in suffocating debt. He had over-leveraged everything they owned to pay for her exclusive country club memberships and endless designer wardrobes. When the banks came to collect and repossess their modest starter home, Aaron came crying to this exact ghetto house to beg for his financial life. Courtney stared at me, her face pale, but her sheer arrogance refused to yield. She called me a liar, loudly insisting Aaron bought the estate with his massive corporate bonus. I opened the folder and slid the original lease agreement toward her. I pointed to the signature line. There, in stark black ink, was Aaron Carmichael's signature, explicitly agreeing to lease the property from Horizon Estate Holdings for $15,000 a month. I flipped the page and showed her the official deed confirming Horizon Estate Holdings was the sole owner. I watched the brutal reality hit her. for half a decade. She had paraded around the wealthy suburbs looking down on working-class people, utterly oblivious to the fact that she was living in a house owned by a black man she actively despised entirely rent-free. She looked at Aaron furiously, demanding he deny it, but he just shook his head, confirming the pathetic truth. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. I walked into the hallway closet and pulled out a stack of flattened cardboard moving boxes I had purchased earlier that morning. I walked back into the living room and dropped the cardboard directly at Courtney's feet with a loud thud. I told them they had exactly 30 days to pack up 10,000 square feet of stolen luxury. I advised them to start with the fine china, as it takes a while to wrap properly without breaking. Aaron finally broke under the pressure. He fell to his knees right there on the rug, the pristine cashmere of his coat pooling around him in a pathetic display. He grabbed my hand, sobbing, pleading with me to stop this madness. He swore that the text message was a terrible mistake, that Courtney was just severely stressed about hosting Christmas, and that they desperately wanted me at the house for the holidays. He promised to pay me back every single dime, to set up a rigid payment plan, to do whatever I wanted if I just ripped up the eviction notice and let them stay. I pulled my hand away from his desperate grasp. I told him he was a 38-year-old man acting like a spoiled toddler, and that a payment plan on nearly $1 million in back rent would take him 3 entire lifetimes to pay off on his current salary. Courtney, however, did not drop to her knees. The exposure of her fake wealth did not humble her in the slightest. Instead, it ignited a vicious cornered rage. She kicked the moving boxes away from her expensive boots. She screamed that she would not be thrown out into the street like a common criminal. She stated that I was nothing but a manipulative, controlling monster who trapped her husband in a predatory contract just to hold sick power over them. She completely refused to accept any accountability, twisting the narrative to make herself the ultimate victim of my supposed cruelty. She grabbed Aaron by the collar, pulling him aggressively to his feet, and slapped him across the chest, ordering him to stop begging a man who clearly hated them. She glared at me with absolute venom, declaring that she was the mother of my only grandchild and that she alone dictated the terms of this family. I looked her dead in the eye and told her she dictated absolutely nothing anymore. I pointed firmly to the front door and told them to get out of my house before I called the police to remove them for trespassing. Courtney did not move toward the door immediately. She stood her ground, her breathing heavy, a dark, calculating glint replacing the panic in her eyes. She straightened her designer coat and lifted her chin, staring at me with a cold, terrifying resolve. She stated that I was making a massive mistake. She vowed to hire the most ruthless, aggressive family law attorney in Chicago. She promised to drag me into a grueling courtroom battle, draining every single asset I had hidden away in my little shell companies. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a sinister whisper, and threatened to sue me for total control of the estate. She declared that no judge would side with an angry, isolated man who was clearly suffering from severe cognitive decline. She said she would testify under oath that I had completely lost my mind, that I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs, and that she would personally see to it that I was locked away in a facility while she took over everything. She grabbed Aaron's arm and stormed out, slamming the door behind them. The front door had barely shut behind them before Courtney executed her first vindictive act of warfare. I walked over to the landline on my kitchen counter and dialed my 16-year-old granddaughter's cell phone number. I wanted to hear Lily's voice to wish her a Merry Christmas before the toxic poison her mother was spewing fully corrupted the holiday spirit. The line did not even ring once. It went straight to a generic automated voicemail message indicating the number was disconnected or unreachable. I pulled out my own cell phone and sent a simple text message. It immediately bounced back as undeliverable. Courtney had actually done it. She had snatched the device out of her own daughter's hands, blocked my number across all platforms, and severed my only line of communication with my grandchild. Using a teenager as a human shield was a vile, cowardly tactic, but it was exactly the kind of behavior I expected from a woman who valued social status over genuine family bonds. She believed that by cutting off my access to Lily, she could bring me to my knees. She thought holding my flesh and blood hostage would force me to tear up the eviction notice and turn the money tap back on. It was a classic emotional blackmail strategy designed to exploit a grandfather's love and force a surrender. She wanted me to panic, to feel the agonizing ache of separation, and to ultimately hand over my wealth just to buy my way back into my granddaughter's life. I set the phone down on the counter. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear. I simply recognized her desperate move for exactly what it was, a declaration of total war. If Courtney wanted to weaponize my granddaughter's future, I was going to ensure that future was entirely out of her greedy reach. I grabbed my heavy winter coat and my truck keys. I had a very important appointment to make. The drive to the downtown financial district was quiet, the streets mostly empty on the cold holiday morning. I parked my battered truck outside the towering glass structure that housed my private wealth management firm. Oliver Price, my ruthless corporate attorney, and David Chen, my senior wealth manager, were already waiting for me in a secure, soundproof conference room. They had canceled their own holiday plans the moment I called, knowing that when I activated a financial protocol, it required absolute and immediate execution. I sat down at the massive, polished mahogany table and instructed David to pull up the specific records for the custodial education accounts. When Lily was born, I made a silent promise to my late wife that our granddaughter would never carry the crippling burden of student loan debt. While Aaron and Courtney were busy blowing their massive corporate income on luxury car leases, exotic vacations, and exorbitant country club fees, I was quietly funneling my own cash into a high-yield college savings account. Over the past 16 years, through careful investments and compounding interest, that account had grown to a massive $200,000. It was more than enough to cover tuition, room, and board at any Ivy League university in the country. However, because Aaron was Lily's legal guardian, the account was structured in a way that gave him and Courtney partial administrative oversight once Lily turned 18. Courtney knew all about this money. She constantly bragged to her wealthy suburban friends that her daughter had a fully funded trust, heavily implying that her own brilliant financial planning had secured it. I knew exactly what would happen the second the reality of their impending eviction and bankruptcy set in. Courtney would look at that $200,000 education fund not as her daughter's future, but as a personal emergency piggy bank. She would find a legal loophole to drain the account using Lily's college money to rent a new luxury apartment or pay off her mounting designer credit card debts. She would steal her own child's education just to maintain her aristocratic illusion. I refused to let that happen. That money was forged from my sweat and my late wife's prayers. I looked Oliver dead in the eye and gave the definitive order. I told him to dissolve the current custodial structure immediately and transfer every single cent of the $200,000 into a newly formed ironclad, irrevocable trust. Oliver's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up the aggressive legal framework we had prepared for extreme contingencies. I dictated the terms with absolute ruthlessness. The primary stipulation was that neither Aaron nor Courtney could ever act as trustees, administrators, or beneficiaries under any circumstances. They were legally walled off from the funds, forever stripped of any authority to even view the account balances. The second stipulation was the age of disbursement. Lily would not receive direct access to the money at 18. She would receive it at exactly 25 years old. By that age, her frontal lobe would be fully developed. She would likely have finished her undergraduate degree through scholarships or independent loans, and she would be far beyond the manipulative grasp of her mother. Until then, Oliver's law firm would act as the sole independent trustee authorized only to disperse funds directly to accredited educational institutions, bypassing the parents entirely. I signed the heavy stack of legal documents, the aggressive scratch of my pen sealing the fate of $250,000. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction as David hit the final execution command on his secure terminal. The funds instantly vanished from the old shared banking system, securely locked away in a financial fortress that Courtney could never breach. She thought she could use my granddaughter as leverage to control me. Instead, I just removed the most valuable asset connected to her daughter's name, ensuring that Courtney could never touch a dime of the wealth she so desperately craved. I stood up, shook Oliver's hand, and walked out of the towering glass building. The freezing Chicago air felt refreshing against my face. I got back into my truck and turned the ignition, knowing that the shock waves of my morning activities were about to hit the wealthy suburbs like a devastating earthquake. The financial isolation was now absolutely flawless. Exactly one day after Christmas, the true brutal consequences of my financial cutoff violently crashed down on Courtney's pristine world. She was sitting in her empty, freezing mansion, aggressively ignoring the cardboard moving boxes scattered across the hardwood floor when her cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed the prestigious crest of the elite private academy Lily attended. Courtney answered the phone, forcing her usual arrogant, polished tone, fully expecting a call regarding an upcoming charity gala. The head of admissions did not return the pleasantries. He bluntly informed Courtney that the spring semester tuition auto-pay had bounced entirely, Furthermore, the alternative luxury credit cards on file were coming up as canceled or frozen by the issuing banks. The administrator coldly stated that the academy had a strict zero-tolerance policy for delinquent accounts, especially from families presenting a financial risk, until the $40,000 balance was paid in full via certified wire transfer. Lily was officially suspended and barred from attending classes, walking onto the campus, or participating in any extracurricular activities. Courtney dropped the phone, staring at the blank screen in absolute horror as the complete destruction of her social status became undeniable. The fallout from Lily's school suspension was swift, brutal, and entirely predictable. My personal cell phone remained completely silent, but I knew the sprawling suburban mansion was currently a volatile war zone of pointing fingers and shattered egos. I did not waste a single second of my time imagining Courtney's manic panic or Aaron's pathetic attempts to placate her relentless screaming. Instead, I focused entirely on the next phase of my reclamation protocol. I sat in the heavy, rich leather chair across from Oliver Price in his dimly lit, highly secure downtown law office. The thick mahogany desk between us held a massive, heavily bound dossier. It was the culmination of a deep-dive financial forensic investigation I had quietly commissioned 3 weeks prior, long before the disrespectful Christmas text message that officially ignited this war. I had always suspected my son and his entitled wife were living dangerously beyond their means, but I needed to know the exact anatomical structure of their financial rot. Oliver did not offer warm pleasantries or small talk. He simply slid the massive folder toward me, his expression grim and utterly professional. I flipped open the heavy cover, greeted instantly by a mountain of banking statements, offshore routing numbers, and highly classified corporate ledgers. The private investigator had left absolutely no stone unturned. Every hidden debt, every fraudulent loan application, every desperate attempt to maintain their aristocratic illusion was documented in stark black ink. I put on my reading glasses, methodically turning the pages, ready to dissect the sheer magnitude of their failures. I expected to see standard credit card debt and perhaps a few defaulted personal loans. What I found was a labyrinth of deceit so profound it made my blood run entirely cold. The financial hole Aaron and Courtney had dug for themselves was not just a symptom of careless spending. It was a masterclass in aggressive systemic fraud. The first major revelation was dedicated entirely to Courtney's so-called business empire. For the past 4 years, she had paraded around her exclusive country club as the brilliant founder and CEO of an upscale high-end fashion boutique located in a premium downtown shopping district. She hosted lavish launch parties, rubbed elbows with local wealthy influencers, and constantly bragged about her entrepreneurial genius. She regularly treated her minority employees with blatant condescension and racial microaggressions, projecting the image of a ruthless, self-made white tycoon who was vastly superior to her working-class black father-in-law. The reality exposed meticulously in the forensic accounting reports in front of me was nothing short of pathetic. The boutique was a catastrophic failure from the very day it opened its doors. It had never turned a single cent of actual profit. Instead, it operated as a highly sophisticated vanity project and a literal money pit. Courtney was using the business accounts as a personal slush fund to launder her massive skyrocketing credit card debt. She would order luxury inventory on the company line, secretly keep the best designer items for her own personal wardrobe to flash at suburban charity galas, and then write the missing inventory off as corporate losses. To keep the physical doors open and the grand illusion alive, she had taken out predatory merchant cash advances at astronomical interest rates, actively forging Aaron's signature to list him as the primary personal guarantor without his full comprehension. She was bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just to play the role of a powerful executive. The sheer scale of her financial incompetence was staggering. She had built a towering house of cards on a foundation of quicksand, relying entirely on the invisible, unlimited cash flow I was blindly providing to keep the aggressive creditors at bay. Without my monthly influx of hidden capital, the boutique was instantly insolvent. The documents showed that within the next 72 hours, the commercial landlord was slated to lock the doors and legally seize the remaining inventory, completely shattering her carefully curated identity as a successful business owner. But her boutique was merely the appetizer in this banquet of financial ruin. Oliver leaned forward, tapping his expensive silver pen against a separate, highly flagged section of the dossier marked with a bright red tab. He advised me to look very closely at Aaron's primary employment records. Aaron was a mid-level financial director at a highly reputable corporate logistics firm, a white-collar job he believed made him far superior to his father, who owned warehouses and drove a pickup truck. I turned to the flagged pages, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted internal transfer logs the private investigator had miraculously managed to unearth. Oliver explained that when I abruptly severed their financial lifelines on Christmas Eve, the sudden shock to their system did not just cause declined credit cards at a luxury ski resort. It triggered a catastrophic, unavoidable chain reaction. The $15,000 mortgage, the luxury car leases, and Courtney's predatory business loans were all set to auto-draft from a primary account that was suddenly bone dry. In a state of absolute sheer desperation to prevent immediate public exposure and total bankruptcy, Aaron had made a fatal, irreversible decision. He did not sell his expensive watches. He did not sit his wife down and force her to downsize. Instead, he used his high-level security clearance at his corporate firm to completely bypass the internal auditing software. The ledgers sitting right in front of me showed a series of unauthorized, highly complex wire transfers originating from his company's primary holding accounts and funneling directly into a dummy corporation Aaron had hastily set up under a fake name. He was actively siphoning off massive sums of corporate capital to cover his personal debts, hoping he could magically replace the stolen funds before the upcoming quarterly audit. He was shifting phantom money around in a desperate, pathetic attempt to keep his wife's luxurious illusion intact. He had effectively transformed himself from a pretentious, arrogant executive into a common, desperate thief. The panic practically bled through the ink on the pages. He had convinced himself he was simply borrowing the money, a temporary fix to bridge the gap until he could manipulate or bully me into turning the cash tap back on. I stared at the irrefutable, undeniable evidence of my son's monumental crime. He was actively embezzling corporate funds. The amount he had stolen in just the past few days crossed the threshold into a major federal offense. He had stolen over $200,000 in less than 48 hours. Oliver looked at me with a deadly serious expression, confirming the grim reality of the situation. Aaron's company had scheduled a routine internal financial audit for the following week. The exact moment those forensic accountants looked at the discrepancy, the missing funds would be instantly flagged and traced right back to his dummy corporation. Aaron was not just facing a humiliating termination or a quiet resignation to save face. He had crossed a hard, unforgiving legal line. The evidence was absolute and undeniable. My son was staring directly down the barrel of a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. I left Oliver Price's office with the heavy knowledge of my son's impending federal indictment burning in my mind. Aaron was actively embezzling corporate funds to plug the massive financial crater I had opened. Instead of driving back to the south side, I steered my battered, rust-spotted Ford pickup truck directly toward the affluent northern suburbs. I was heading to the Oak Bridge Country Club. It was an ultra-exclusive, predominantly white establishment where memberships cost more than most people earned in a decade. It was Courtney's absolute favorite place on earth, the epicenter of her carefully fabricated aristocratic universe. I knew for a fact she was hosting a lavish, desperate luncheon there this very afternoon. She had gathered 6 of the wealthiest women in her social circle to drink expensive champagne and eat caviar. It was a pathetic, frantic attempt to prove to her peers that the rumors of her declining credit cards were completely false, likely funded by the very money my son was currently stealing from his employer. I pulled my old truck right up to the grand entrance, parking it squarely between a gleaming Bentley and a brand new Range Rover. The valet, a young kid in a crisp uniform, stared at my vehicle in absolute shock, unsure of what to do. I tossed him the keys with a crisp $20 bill and walked up the pristine marble stairs. I pushed open the heavy mahogany and glass double doors, stepping into the grand foyer. I was wearing my usual faded flannel shirt, a pair of worn denim jeans, and my scuffed steel-toed work boots. The atmosphere in the lobby instantly shifted. The soft piano music seemed to fade. Wealthy patrons in tailored golf attire and designer dresses stopped sipping their drinks, turning to stare at me with thinly veiled disdain. I was a working-class black man invading their pristine elite sanctuary, and my presence was an aggressive disruption to their perfectly manicured reality. I ignored their glaring eyes and walked deliberately toward the main dining room, my heavy boots thudding loudly against the polished marble floor. I did not have to search for Courtney. Her shrill performative laughter echoed from a prime table near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th hole. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne, regaling her audience with some fabricated story about Aaron's massive new corporate bonus. Then her eyes shifted toward the entrance. She saw me. The fake bright smile completely vanished from her face, replaced instantly by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. All the blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking sickly and pale. She slammed her champagne flute down on the table with such force that the crystal nearly shattered, muttered a frantic excuse to her elite friends, and practically sprinted across the dining room to intercept me. She hit me like a hurricane of expensive perfume and sheer panic. Before I could even speak, she grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging fiercely into my flannel sleeve, and tried to physically shove me behind a large decorative pillar near the kitchen service doors, desperate to hide me from the view of the dining room. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a venomous, frantic whisper. "You are completely out of your mind. You cannot be here. You are embarrassing me." Her reaction was the culmination of a decade of intense racist paranoia. Courtney had spent years painstakingly curating her image among these women. She had aggressively sold them a fictional narrative that she came from old established money, and that she had married into an equally elite, highly sophisticated family. She actively hid my existence from her social circle, terrified that her wealthy white country club friends would discover her father-in-law was a blue-collar black man from the South Side. To her, my very presence was a toxic stain that threatened to completely shatter her carefully constructed illusion of racial and financial superiority. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust, her eyes lingering on my work boots. "You do not belong in a place like this," she spat, her tone dripping with intense classist hatred. "Look at you. You look like a homeless vagrant. My friends are staring. You are ruining my reputation." She reached into her designer handbag, her hands shaking with fury. "I am going to call the head of security right now," she threatened, jabbing her finger at my chest. "I am going to have you dragged out of here in handcuffs for trespassing, and I will make sure the police lock you in a psychiatric ward for stalking me. Get out the back door right now before I destroy you." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward toward the service doors. I simply planted my steel-toed boots firmly into the carpet and looked down at her flushed, furious face with absolute indifference. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not attempt to defend my presence. I simply raised a single calloused hand high into the air, holding it steady above the bustling noise of the dining room. Courtney scoffed, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh. "What are you doing?" she sneered, looking at me as if I had truly lost my mind. "Do you think raising your hand is going to magically summon a taxi to take you back to the ghetto? You are making a complete fool of yourself." But I was not signaling for a taxi. My raised hand caught the immediate attention of the club's general manager, a notoriously stiff, arrogant man named Arthur Sterling, who was standing near the grand staircase. He had spent his entire career catering to the whims of the ultra-rich, famously rejecting new applicants who did not meet his strict elitist standards. When he saw my hand in the air, his entire demeanor changed in a fraction of a second. He abandoned a conversation with a prominent local billionaire, his face turning entirely pale. He practically sprinted across the dining room, pushing past waiters and wealthy members with an urgency bordering on sheer panic. Courtney crossed her arms with a triumphant, malicious smirk as he approached. "Arthur, thank God you are here," she said, loudly projecting her voice so her friends at the nearby table could hear her command authority. "This man wandered in off the street. He is harassing me. Please call security immediately and have him removed from the premises. He is completely unhinged." She waited for the manager to grab my arm and forcibly eject me. Instead, Arthur Sterling completely ignored her. He stepped right past Courtney, stopping directly in front of me, to the absolute shock of everyone watching. This notoriously arrogant man bowed his head deeply, his posture radiating pure, unadulterated reverence. "Mr. Carmichael," he said, his voice trembling with anxious respect, "it is an absolute honor to have you here at the club today, sir. I was not informed you were coming. Is everything to your satisfaction? Please tell me how I can be of service." Courtney's brain essentially short-circuited. Her triumphant smirk instantly vanished, her mouth falling open in a display of total paralyzing shock. She looked back and forth between the bowing manager and my faded flannel shirt, completely unable to process the impossible scene unfolding in front of her. She did not know the absolute truth about the Oakbridge Country Club. 6 years ago, this ultra-exclusive establishment was drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. and facing total foreclosure due to gross mismanagement. One of my commercial holding companies bought their debt in absolute secrecy, injecting the massive capital required to keep the doors open and the staff employed. I was not just a guest. I was the silent, absolute majority stakeholder of the entire property. I owned the ground she was currently standing on. I looked at Arthur Sterling and spoke in a clear, carrying voice that echoed across the suddenly quiet dining room. "Arthur," I stated coldly, "you will access the membership registry immediately. You are to permanently revoke the memberships of Aaron and Courtney Carmichael effective this exact second. You will instruct your security team to escort this woman off my property, and you will legally ban her from ever setting foot on these grounds again." Courtney stood frozen in the center of the room, her wealthy friends watching in absolute horrified silence as the security guards approached to throw her out into the cold. The humiliation at the Oakbridge Country Club completely shattered Courtney's remaining sanity, but it did not break her greed. Stripped of her elite status and physically escorted off the premises by security, she dragged a terrified Aaron into the darkest, most desperate corners of the city to salvage their ruined lives. Later that evening, they found themselves sitting in a cracked vinyl booth inside a dimly lit, greasy diner on the outskirts of town. It was a place where nobody from their suburban social circle would ever be caught dead. Across the sticky table sat Victor Vance, a notoriously unethical, bottom-feeding lawyer who specialized in exploiting legal loopholes and manufacturing predatory lawsuits. Aaron was sweating profusely, his hands trembling around a cheap ceramic coffee mug. He was acutely aware that the corporate auditors were closing in on his massive embezzlement, and his entire existence hinged on regaining access to my immense newly discovered wealth. Courtney, hiding her face behind massive designer sunglasses despite the lack of sunlight, leaned across the table. She looked like a feral, cornered animal. Her voice was a hushed, frantic hiss as she demanded Victor find a way to circumvent the eviction notice and instantly seize control of my entire estate. She painted a picture of absolute victimhood, claiming they were being financially abused by a tyrannical, erratic father. Victor simply stirred his black coffee, a sleazy, calculating smile stretching across his face. He told them that fighting a billionaire in civil court over a lease agreement was a guaranteed losing battle. If they wanted the money, they could not attack my contracts. They had to attack my mind. He promised them a strategy that would bypass normal legal battles and hand them the keys to my kingdom. What Aaron Courtney and their sleazy legal counsel did not know was that they were not alone in that dingy diner. Sitting just 2 booths away, concealed behind a worn newspaper and a plate of untouched fries, was Oliver Price's top private investigator. A high-grade directional audio receiver was tucked discreetly into his jacket, capturing every single treacherous syllable spoken at their table. Through the crystal-clear audio feed, the investigator recorded a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Courtney turned her venomous focus entirely onto her husband, twisting the narrative to weaponize Aaron's mounting panic. She grabbed Aaron's shaking hands and stared deeply into his eyes, feeding him a highly calculated, monstrous lie. She insisted that my recent behavior was not an act of revenge, but a glaring, undeniable symptom of severe cognitive decline. She argued that a rational, healthy father would never cancel his only son's credit cards, evict his own family, or cause a public scene at a country club. She completely erased her own racism, entitlement, and financial abuse from the equation. Instead, she diagnosed me with aggressive late-stage dementia and dangerous paranoia. She told Aaron that I was clearly losing my grip on reality, behaving erratically, and destroying the family legacy because my brain was actively deteriorating. She framed their malicious plot to steal my assets as a noble, desperate act of love. She convinced him that they needed to legally strip me of my rights in order to protect me from myself. Aaron, who was staring down the barrel of a 10-year federal prison sentence for embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his employer, swallowed the lie without a single ounce of hesitation. He desperately needed to believe I was crazy because acknowledging my sanity meant acknowledging his own catastrophic failures and impending incarceration. The audio recording captured Aaron nodding rapidly, his voice thick with fake concern as he agreed that his father was clearly suffering from a mental break. They justified the ultimate betrayal, convincing themselves that locking me away and hijacking my multi-million-dollar empire was the only moral option left to save their family from ruin. The private investigator meticulously documented the entire exchange, ensuring that Oliver and I possessed absolute proof of their premeditated malice. Every word Courtney spoke was a calculated strike to dismantle my autonomy, and Aaron was a willing, eager accomplice. With Aaron fully indoctrinated into the delusion of my mental collapse, Victor Vance pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his battered leather briefcase and laid them out on the sticky table. He instructed them to stop thinking about eviction notices and start thinking about total domination. He outlined a ruthless, highly aggressive legal strategy known as an emergency conservatorship. Victor explained that if they could convince a judge that I was in immediate danger to myself and my estate due to severe mental incompetence, the court would instantly freeze every single asset attached to my name, all of my bank accounts, my real estate holding companies, my massive logistics warehouses, and my personal trusts would be completely immobilized. The court would then legally strip me of my fundamental human rights, rendering me incapable of making financial, medical, or personal decisions. In my place, the judge would appoint a legal guardian to manage my life and my fortune. Victor promised Aaron that as my only living son, he was the default candidate for that role. Aaron would be granted absolute, unchecked authority to drain my accounts, sell my properties, and funnel my immense wealth directly into his own pockets to cover his massive embezzlement debts. He would become the absolute dictator of my existence. Right there in the diner, illuminated by a flickering neon sign, they drafted the malicious petition. Courtney dictated a fabricated list of my supposedly erratic behaviors, exaggerating every interaction to paint me as a hostile, paranoid old man disconnected from reality. She falsely claimed I was hoarding medications, wandering the streets, confused and suffering from violent delusions. Victor happily wrote down every lie, formatting their greed into formal legal jargon. He explained that the emergency petition would be filed the very next day, but to ensure the judge granted the immediate freeze on my assets. They needed one undeniable piece of evidence. They needed a medical professional to officially certify my insanity. Aaron panicked, stammering that I had not seen a doctor in months and would never agree to a psychiatric evaluation. Victor just laughed, a dark, greedy sound that echoed over the audio feed. He assured them that medical ethics were merely a suggestion when you had the right connections. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, explaining that the legal system was full of underpaid professionals willing to bend the rules for a generous cash bribe. He promised Aaron and Courtney that the medical evidence would be completely fabricated and entirely bulletproof. Victor dialed a number and held a brief, hushed conversation with a contact he kept on a very lucrative retainer. He hung up the phone and looked at Aaron and Courtney with a triumphant, predatory grin. He informed them that he had just secured the services of a highly corrupt court-appointed psychiatrist who specialized in signing off on fraudulent conservatorships for a substantial fee. This doctor did not care about medical accuracy or ethical guidelines. He only cared about the envelope of cash Victor promised to deliver. Victor leaned across the diner table and delivered the final chilling piece of their master plan. He told Aaron that the psychiatrist was officially booked and scheduled to arrive at my home on the south side at exactly 9 o'clock the very next morning. The doctor was already prepared to diagnose me with severe, irreversible dementia, setting the legal trap perfectly in motion. The financial guillotine was primed, and they firmly believed my fate was entirely sealed. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through my small brick house. I opened the front door to find a man in a tailored gray suit holding an expensive leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Dr. Evans. He flashed a brilliant, entirely hollow smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He did not ask for permission to enter. He simply pushed past me, stepping into my living room with an air of absolute, unearned authority. He looked around at my worn furniture and faded rugs, his nose wrinkling slightly as if the modesty of my home offended his delicate sensibilities. He sat down heavily in my armchair, clicking his expensive pen, and gestured for me to sit on the sofa opposite him. His entire demeanor was dripping with a toxic, patronizing arrogance. When he spoke, he completely dropped his normal speaking voice, adopting a slow, exaggerated, high-pitched tone that ignorant people usually reserve for toddlers or stray animals. "Well, now, Wesley," he said, drawing out the syllables of my name. "How are we feeling today? Are we having a good morning, or are we feeling a little bit lost?" The sheer condescension was palpable. He did not treat me like a 69-year-old man with a lifetime of experience. He treated me like a broken, fragile object that needed to be managed. He leaned forward, tapping his clipboard, and began firing off a barrage of insulting elementary questions. He asked me if I knew what city I was in. He asked me if I knew my own middle name. He asked me if I remembered eating breakfast, aggressively implying that I probably forgot to feed myself. I did not get angry at his blatant disrespect. I did not correct his incredibly insulting tone. Instead, I gave him exactly what Courtney and Aaron had paid him to see. I let my shoulders slump forward, instantly transforming my posture from a commanding, confident businessman into a frail, defeated old man. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly as they rested on my knees. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of deep, unsettling confusion onto my face, and stared blankly at the wall behind his head. When I answered his elementary questions, I deliberately slurred my words, letting my voice crack and falter. I told him I was not entirely sure what day of the week it was. I nervously patted my pockets, pretending to look for a pair of reading glasses that were already sitting right on top of my head. The doctor smirked, his pen flying across the official medical evaluation forms. It was breathtakingly easy to exploit his deeply ingrained prejudices. To a corrupt, elite professional like him, an elderly black man living in a modest South Side home was already a stereotype of decline and poverty. He did not see a brilliant corporate mind hiding in plain sight. He saw a vulnerable target and an easy payday. I leaned heavily into the performance, deciding to give him a masterclass in fabricated dementia. I looked toward the empty kitchen and called out for my late wife, asking her if the coffee was ready, yet completely acting as if she were still alive and bustling around the stove. I then turned back to the doctor, blinking rapidly, and asked him if he was the plumber I had called about the leaky sink. The absolute glee radiating from the doctor was sickening. He did not show a single ounce of medical concern or human compassion for a man he believed was actively losing his grip on reality. He was thrilled. He asked me if my son Aaron was a good boy, and I responded by trailing off into a nonsensical mumble about property taxes from 20 years ago. I was feeding him an absolute mountain of fictitious medical symptoms, and he was eagerly swallowing every single bite without hesitation. After barely 15 minutes of his sham evaluation, the doctor stopped asking questions entirely. He did not conduct a single standard cognitive test. He did not check my vitals, ask for my medical history, or follow any established psychiatric protocols. He had the narrative he was bribed to construct, and that was all the justification he needed. He clicked his pen and began filling out the final diagnostic conclusion on the heavily watermarked court documents. He did not even bother to hide his malicious intent. He spoke his diagnosis aloud as he wrote it down, securing the final nails in my manufactured coffin. "Well, Wesley," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "it is quite clear that you are suffering from severe advanced cognitive decline. Your paranoia, your inability to recognize reality, and your dangerous memory lapses mean you are no longer fit to live independently. But do not worry at all. You have a very loving son and a wonderful daughter-in-law who are stepping up to take full control of your life and your finances. They are going to manage your estate so you do not have to stress your fragile little mind anymore." I sat there maintaining my vacant, confused stare while internally memorizing every single damning word leaving his corrupt mouth. He flipped to the final page of the thick legal packet, the document that would be submitted directly to a judge to officially strip me of my human rights. He aggressively signed his name on the bottom line, applying a heavy, authoritative medical stamp right next to his signature to make the fraud completely legally binding. He packed the fraudulent documents back into his leather briefcase with a satisfying snap. The trap was now fully set. According to the medical and legal system, I was officially incompetent. My fortune was theoretically frozen, and Aaron was poised to step in as my absolute financial dictator. The doctor stood up, brushing off his tailored suit, looking incredibly pleased with himself for earning a massive bribe for 15 minutes of unethical criminal work. He did not offer a goodbye or a shred of basic dignity. He simply turned his back on me and marched out of my living room, eager to collect his illicit payout. Through the front window, I watched the doctor step off my porch and immediately pull his cell phone from his pocket. I could clearly see his lips moving as he dialed a number. Even through the thick glass, I knew exactly who he was calling and exactly what he was saying. He was calling Courtney to proudly announce that the job was completely done, the medical documents were signed, and I was officially, legally incapacitated. I watched him climb into his luxury sedan and drive away, speeding back toward the wealthy suburbs. The second his car disappeared around the corner, my slumped, fragile posture vanished entirely. I sat up straight, my mind sharper and clearer than it had been in decades. I calmly reached my hand directly under the solid wood of my coffee table. My fingers brushed against a small, sleek piece of metal securely taped to the underside. I pressed a tiny red button, turning off the high-grade military-level audio recorder I had installed the night before. Every patronizing insult, every fabricated symptom, and every single piece of medical fraud was perfectly captured in crystal clear, undeniable audio. While I sat in the quiet comfort of my Southside home, carefully transferring the damning audio files to a secure, encrypted server, Courtney was orchestrating a magnificent theater of delusion 30 miles away in the affluent northern suburbs. It was Christmas Eve, the exact night they had so viciously uninvited me from. Rather than using this time to pack their belongings or confront the looming reality of their eviction, Courtney had chosen to double down on her aristocratic facade. She was hosting the most extravagant, lavish holiday gala their exclusive neighborhood had ever seen. The sprawling limestone mansion was completely transformed into a winter wonderland of absolute excess. Towering ice sculptures carved into the shapes of swans flanked the grand entryway. A live classical string quartet played softly in the corner of the massive living room. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the crowd of 80 elite guests, offering silver trays loaded with imported caviar and vintage champagne. Courtney was gliding through the room in a sparkling, floor-length designer gown, her face plastered with a manic, triumphant smile. She was aggressively overcompensating, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth to actively combat the vicious rumors that were slowly starting to circulate about their abrupt departure from the country club. She laughed loudly, touching the arms of local politicians and billionaire wives, weaving a desperate narrative that her family was thriving. She wanted to prove to everyone and perhaps to herself that she was untouchable, that her status was permanent, and that she belonged at the absolute top of the suburban hierarchy. Aaron, however, stood shivering near the massive fireplace, clutching a glass of scotch like a life preserver. He knew the terrifying truth hiding behind the glittering ice sculptures and the expensive champagne. The extravagant Christmas gala was not funded by a sudden corporate bonus or a miraculous financial windfall. It was financed by pure, unadulterated financial suicide. When I abruptly severed their unlimited cash flow, I did not just cut off their luxury car leases and their mortgage. I completely canceled the high-limit platinum credit cards Courtney used to breathe. With her accounts frozen and her fake boutique bleeding cash, she had no legitimate way to pay for a holiday party that cost more than a luxury vehicle. But Courtney's obsession with maintaining her white elite status completely overrode any basic sense of financial survival. Desperate to keep up appearances and terrified of being exposed as a fraud, she had turned to the darkest, most predatory corners of the financial sector. Without Aaron's knowledge, she had forged his signature on a series of aggressive high-interest payday loans and unsecured personal credit lines from predatory lenders. She had borrowed $50,000 at a staggering interest rate, essentially signing away their non-existent future just to buy imported seafood and hire a string quartet for a single night. Aaron had only discovered the catastrophic loan documents hidden in her home office desk a few hours before the guests arrived. He had begged her to cancel the caterers, pleading with her to understand that they were actively facing federal prison bankruptcy and homelessness. But Courtney refused to listen. She slapped the documents out of his hands, screaming that canceling the annual Christmas Eve gala would be social suicide, an admission of defeat to the wealthy neighbors she desperately needed to impress. She forced him to put on a tailored tuxedo and smile, demanding he play the role of the successful financial executive while their entire world actively burned to the ground around them. Aaron stood in the corner of his living room, sweating profusely inside his expensive suit, watching his wife burn stolen borrowed money just to maintain a lie. He knew the corporate auditors were coming for him. He knew my eviction notice was ticking down, and he knew that the predatory lenders his wife had just defrauded would not hesitate to destroy them. The opulence surrounding him felt like a heavy, suffocating tomb. The grand-grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10 o'clock. Courtney signaled the string quartet to stop playing. She grabbed a fresh crystal flute of champagne from a passing waiter and positioned herself halfway up the sweeping mahogany staircase, ensuring every single eye in the massive room was focused entirely on her. She tapped a silver spoon against the delicate crystal, the sharp ringing sound silencing the wealthy crowd. She beamed, radiating a toxic manufactured warmth, and began a highly rehearsed, arrogant toast. She thanked her elite friends for joining them, aggressively boasting about Aaron's supposed massive success at his financial firm, and bragging about the incredible, blessed year their family was having. She raised her glass high into the air, preparing to deliver the final smug punchline of her speech. But she never got the chance to finish. A blinding flash of rotating yellow strobe lights suddenly flooded through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. completely overpowering the soft, elegant glow of the holiday decorations. The heavy, unmistakable roar of massive diesel engines shattered the quiet, refined atmosphere of the suburban street. The wealthy guests gasped, parting like the Red Sea as they rushed to the windows to see what was causing the aggressive disruption. Two enormous heavy-duty commercial tow trucks were aggressively backing up directly onto Courtney's meticulously manicured front lawn, their massive tires churning the pristine white snow and tearing deep, muddy trenches into the expensive landscaping. Courtney dropped her champagne flute. The expensive crystal shattered against the hardwood floor, the spilled wine pooling around her designer heels. Before anyone could process the shocking scene, the heavy front doors of the mansion were pushed violently open. Two massive, uncompromising repossession agents marched directly into the grand foyer, their heavy, snow-covered work boots staining the expensive Persian rugs. They did not care about the designer gowns or the imported caviar. They held thick metal clipboards and carried heavy steel chains over their broad shoulders. The lead agent, a towering man with a thick beard and a booming, authoritative voice, completely ignored Courtney standing frozen on the staircase. He looked directly into the crowd of terrified, silent elites and called out the names Aaron and Courtney Carmichael with a harsh, unforgiving volume that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The lead repo agent loudly announced that they were officially seizing the Mercedes-Benz and the Porsche SUV due to severe long-term non-payment and explicitly canceled lease agreements. He demanded the keys immediately, warning that they would aggressively drag the vehicles onto the flatbeds if they did not comply. The string quartet sat completely frozen. The wealthy guests covered their mouths wide-eyed and horrified, whispering frantically to one another as the ultimate social disgrace unfolded right in front of them. The pristine, aristocratic facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The illusion of wealth was dead. The elite guests did not stay to offer comfort. They grabbed their expensive fur coats and practically sprinted out the front door, fleeing the mansion as if poverty were a highly contagious disease. They hurried past the massive tow trucks, actively hooking heavy chains to Courtney's beloved Porsche. Aaron and Courtney were left standing completely alone in the center of their massive empty foyer, surrounded by half-eaten caviar and the devastating, undeniable reality of their total public ruin. The morning after the catastrophic Christmas Eve party, the sprawling suburban mansion was deathly silent. Courtney was locked inside the master bedroom, refusing to speak or even look at her husband. Aaron did not stay to comfort her. He called an expensive black car service he absolutely could not afford and headed straight into the freezing city. He walked into a sleek, aggressively modern office building in the downtown financial district, wiping cold, nervous sweat from his forehead. Sitting across a frosted glass desk from a stone-faced loan officer, Aaron grabbed a heavy metal pen and signed his name on the dotted line of a brutal, uncompromising lending agreement. He was borrowing exactly $100,000. The interest rate was astronomical, bordering on entirely predatory, but Aaron did not care about the long-term financial devastation or the crippling monthly payments he was agreeing to. He only cared about immediate survival in less than 48 hours. The internal auditors at his corporate logistics firm were scheduled to conduct their quarterly review. If those forensic accountants looked at his department's ledgers, they would instantly spot the massive crater of missing capital he had illegally wired to his dummy corporation. He needed cash to quietly plug that hole before anyone noticed the embezzlement. The loan officer stamped the final page, confirming the funds would be wired directly into Aaron's accounts by noon. Aaron let out a ragged, desperate breath of relief. He felt a sudden toxic surge of adrenaline rush through his veins. He had successfully secured the money. He had dodged the federal prison sentence that had been keeping him awake for days. He stood up, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and walked out of the loan office feeling like a victorious conqueror who had just narrowly escaped the guillotine. As Aaron rode the elevator down to the grand lobby, a sickening wave of pure arrogance completely washed away the sheer terror of the past week. He genuinely believed he had just executed a masterful stroke of financial genius. To secure the massive $100,000 cash injection, Aaron had been forced to put up serious collateral. He had legally pledged his entire portfolio of unvested corporate stock options along with the complete balance of his executive retirement accounts. It was an incredibly reckless gamble, essentially betting his entire professional future and his entire life savings on a single desperate hand of cards. But in his warped, desperate mind, it was a brilliant tactical maneuver. He convinced himself that he was infinitely smarter than the system and vastly superior to his father. He scoffed at the memory of my eviction notice and my canceled credit cards. He genuinely thought my attempt to financially ruin him had failed. His grand delusion was perfectly mapped out. He would take this private equity loan, secretly replace the embezzled corporate funds before the audit, and pass the financial review with flying colors. Once the audit was clear, he would receive his massive end-of-year executive bonus, immediately pay off the predatory loan, and use the remaining cash to secure a new luxury apartment for him and Courtney. He would bypass my punishment entirely. He walked out onto the freezing Chicago streets with a smug, defiant smirk plastered across his face. He actually felt sorry for me. He thought I was just a bitter, aging man playing checkers while he was playing high-stakes chess. He believed that despite my massive secret wealth and my aggressive tactics, I simply did not possess the ruthless corporate instinct required to truly crush a modern financial director. He smoothed down his cashmere coat, completely unaware that he was not playing chess at all. He was just a blind rat sprinting enthusiastically through a maze I had meticulously designed, heading straight toward a steel trap that had already been sprung. Aaron strutted confidently into the grand, towering lobby of his corporate headquarters. The humiliating repossession of his luxury vehicles and the absolute destruction of his Christmas party felt like distant memories. He was back in his element, surrounded by polished marble floors, men in tailored suits, and the familiar hum of high-level commerce. He approached the automated glass security turnstiles, pulling his company identification badge from his pocket. He slapped the plastic card against the glowing digital reader, fully expecting the gates to slide open and welcome him back to his corner office. Instead, the machine emitted a harsh, loud buzz. The digital screen flashed a bright, angry red warning. Access denied. Aaron frowned, assuming the magnetic strip was simply malfunctioning due to the cold weather. He wiped the card on his sleeve and swiped it a second time. Denied. He swiped it a third time, hitting the plastic aggressively against the scanner. Before he could call out to the lobby receptionist to complain, two massive, broad-shouldered corporate security guards materialized from behind the reception desk. They did not greet him with their usual polite deference. They flanked him immediately, their expressions completely grim and uncompromising. They ordered Aaron to step away from the turnstiles and follow them to the executive elevators. Aaron demanded to know what was going on, flashing his trademark arrogant attitude, but the guards remained utterly silent. They escorted him up to the top floor, marching him past his own department, past the staring eyes of his stunned colleagues, and directly into the austere, intimidating office of the Chief Human Resources Officer. The company's Chief Financial Officer was also sitting at the long mahogany table, his face a mask of absolute disappointment. Aaron sat down, his heart suddenly hammering violently against his ribs. The smug arrogance from the loan office evaporated in an instant. The Human Resources Director did not offer him a coffee or a friendly greeting. She slid a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder directly across the polished wood table. She coldly informed him that his network access, his corporate email, and his building entry had been completely revoked, effective immediately. The upcoming quarterly audit had been expedited by 72 hours due to an external security alert. The Chief Financial Officer looked Aaron dead in the eye and explained the exact source of that catastrophic alert. The private equity firm that had just issued Aaron his $100,000 emergency loan ran a mandatory corporate compliance check to verify his pledged stock options. During that verification process, the firm formally notified the corporation of Aaron's catastrophic financial distress and massive, unmanageable debt obligations. This notification immediately triggered an emergency internal review of Aaron's department ledgers, exposing the massive crater of missing funds he had desperately tried to hide. Aaron opened the folder with shaking hands, his breathing shallow and rapid. The top document was the official compliance notification letter from the predatory loan company. The bold corporate logo at the top of the heavy paper read, Apex Holdings. Aaron felt his blood freeze completely solid in his veins. He scanned down to the bottom of the page, his terrified eyes locking onto the official signature of the firm's sole proprietor and chief executive officer. The name printed in crisp, undeniable black ink was Wesley Carmichael. I was the faceless creditor. He had pledged his last remaining assets directly to me. Aaron was instantly suspended without pay, pending an immediate federal criminal investigation. The grandfather clock in my hallway chimed twice, its deep resonance swallowed by the heavy freezing silence of the South Side winter. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting in my leather armchair, a glass of water resting on the side table, quietly reviewing the legal documents Oliver Price had drafted regarding Aaron's impending federal charges. The house was locked down secure and completely still. Then a sharp, frantic pounding shattered the quiet. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate, rhythmic hammering of someone actively running from a nightmare. I stood up instantly, my muscles tensing. I walked swiftly to the front hallway and glanced at the high-definition security monitor mounted on the wall. My breath caught in my throat. Standing on my frozen porch, shivering violently under the harsh amber glow of the street lamp, was my 16-year-old granddaughter. Lily was wearing a thin winter coat thrown hastily over flannel pajamas, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest and her face buried in her scarf. I unlocked the deadbolt and threw the heavy wooden door open. The biting wind howled into the foyer, but I did not care. Lily practically collapsed into my arms. She was sobbing, her entire body shaking with a mixture of bone-chilling cold and pure, unadulterated heartbreak. I pulled her inside immediately, slamming the door shut against the storm. I guided her to the kitchen, draped a heavy wool blanket over her trembling shoulders, and turned on the stove to heat water. She had taken a rideshare all the way from the wealthy northern suburbs in the middle of the night, fleeing the sprawling $3 million mansion that had just become an active war zone. I sat across from her at the worn oak dining table, the same table where I had wrapped her Christmas present just a few days prior. I did not bombard her with questions. I poured a mug of hot tea and placed it gently between her frozen hands. Lily took a shaky breath, her eyes bloodshot and swollen from hours of crying. She did not drink the tea. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her cell phone, and placed it flat on the wood. She looked at me, her expression hardening from the face of a terrified child into the visage of a young woman who had just had her entire reality violently shattered. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice raw, "I need you to hear this. I am so sorry." She pressed the play button. The audio was slightly muffled, recorded secretly from behind a closed door, but the voices were crystal clear. It was Courtney. She was screaming not in panic but in pure vitriolic rage. She was on the phone with one of her elite suburban friends, aggressively pacing back and forth in her master bedroom. The words that spilled out of the speaker were entirely vile. Courtney unleashed a torrent of vicious, unfiltered racial slurs, attacking my heritage, my neighborhood, and my very existence. She shrieked that she could not believe she had wasted a decade of her life pretending to respect a ghetto old black man. But the racial hatred was only the appetizer to her true confession. Courtney loudly, proudly admitted that she had never loved Aaron. She mocked his weak corporate ambition and laughed at his pathetic desperation to please her. She explicitly confirmed that she only married into the Carmichael family because she smelled the deep pockets of a silent millionaire. She saw Aaron as a highly malleable pawn, a convenient, legally binding bridge to extract my wealth and fund her aristocratic white suburban fantasies. She bragged to her friend that she had successfully drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from the old fool to build her status, and now that the cash tap was shut off, the entire family was useless to her. Lily hit pause, the silence in the kitchen returning like a physical blow. She looked at me, tears spilling over her cheeks, deeply ashamed of the monster her mother truly was. I reached across the table and covered her shaking hand with mine. I told Lily she had absolutely nothing to be sorry for. The sins of her mother belonged to Courtney and Courtney alone. But Lily shook her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She refused to let the revelation end there. Her voice steadied, dropping into a cold, clinical tone that completely mirrored my own corporate negotiations. She told me that the racist phone call was not the reason she fled into the snow at 2 a.m. She had stayed hidden in the hallway, listening as Courtney ended the phone call and immediately began frantically moving around the massive walk-in closet. Lily had crept the door open just a fraction of an inch. She watched her mother pull 3 massive designer suitcases from the top shelf and aggressively shove her most expensive clothing, jewelry, and remaining luxury goods into the bags. Courtney was not packing for a weekend trip to clear her head. She was executing a highly coordinated, permanent exit strategy. Lily stepped into the room and confronted her mother, directly demanding to know what she was doing. Cornered and stripped of her pristine facade, Courtney did not apologize. She did not try to comfort her weeping daughter. Instead, she completely snapped. In a moment of pure selfish malice, Courtney revealed that her frequent high-end yoga retreats and expensive spa weekends over the past 2 years were an absolute fiction. She had been carrying on an extensive, passionate affair with a private personal trainer she met at the country club. He was a younger, arrogant man who perfectly matched her superficial aesthetic and shared her utter disdain for anyone outside their elite tax bracket. Courtney coldly informed her 16-year-old daughter that the mansion was a sinking ship. Aaron was a pathetic loser facing federal prison, and she had absolutely no intention of sticking around to play the supportive wife during a humiliating public bankruptcy or a messy criminal trial. She told Lily to pack a single bag if she wanted to come along, but made it aggressively clear that maternal duty would not interfere with her immediate escape. Lily refused, utterly disgusted by the vile woman standing in front of her. She grabbed her coat, ordered a car, and ran to the only person in her life who had ever provided genuine, unconditional stability. I sat back in my chair, meticulously processing the timeline of her mother's absolute betrayal. The sheer audacity of Courtney's plan was staggering, but it aligned perfectly with the mind of a parasitic opportunist whose host had just run dry. Lily took a final trembling breath and delivered the ultimate devastating blow. She leaned across the table, her eyes locking onto mine, and revealed the true depth of her mother's criminal exit strategy. Courtney was not leaving empty-handed. While Aaron was asleep in the guest room, completely oblivious to his impending corporate suspension, Courtney had accessed his private laptop. She found the $100,000 cash wire that Apex Holdings had just deposited into their joint banking account to cover his embezzlement. Lily watched her mother aggressively initiate an irreversible wire transfer, draining that exact amount into an offshore account controlled by her lover. Courtney planned to catch a 6 o'clock international flight fleeing the country before sunrise. She was deliberately stealing the only lifeline Aaron had secured, intentionally leaving her husband to face the federal auditors with absolutely zero cash to replace the stolen corporate funds. Aaron was going to wake up to a completely empty bank account, a missing wife, and a guaranteed 10-year federal prison sentence waiting at his office desk. I tucked a heavy wool blanket around my sleeping granddaughter in the spare bedroom, ensuring she was safe from the absolute wreckage of her mother's choices. By 7 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting behind the massive walnut desk in my commercial logistics headquarters, watching the Chicago sunrise reflect off the industrial windows. The faint, rhythmic hum of massive forklifts operating in the warehouse below was the only sound in the room. I was actively coordinating with Oliver Price to freeze the stolen $100,000 wire transfer before Courtney's international flight could even board. Before Oliver could confirm the banking intercept over the phone, the heavy glass double doors of my private executive suite were violently thrown open. They bypassed my security desk entirely, marching into my office with an undeniable aura of blistering, unearned entitlement. It was Courtney's parents, Thomas and Victoria. They were the absolute embodiment of the wealthy. Upper-class white elite, draped in tailored cashmere coats and reeking of aggressive superiority. They had always treated me like a silent servant, a working-class black man who was somehow lucky their daughter had lowered herself to marry my son. They did not knock. They did not greet me. Thomas slammed his heavy leather briefcase onto my polished desk, his face flushed with self-righteous fury. Victoria stood right beside him, her arms crossed tight, glaring at me with undisguised racial contempt. Thomas aggressively leaned forward and demanded to know what kind of sick, tyrannical game I was playing with his daughter. Courtney had apparently called them in a manic panic before heading to the airport, spinning a wild, fabricated narrative that I was a financially abusive monster who had illegally frozen her bank accounts, stolen her cars, and left her destitute in the snow. They had come to my corporate headquarters to forcefully intimidate me, fully expecting the ghetto father-in-law to cower and immediately hand over a blank check. Thomas slammed his fist against the wood of my desk, the loud smack echoing through the quiet executive suite. He loudly declared that his family possessed a pristine generational legacy in this city, and they would not allow a bitter low-class landlord to humiliate their daughter. Victoria sneered, her voice dripping with sheer venom. She told me that if I did not instantly reverse the eviction notice, reinstate Courtney's platinum credit cards, and apologize for my aggressive behavior, they would utterly destroy my commercial reputation. They threatened to call their extensive contacts in the local press, the city council, and the regional chamber of commerce. Thomas bragged about his deep political ties and his flawless standing among the elite suburban society. He explicitly threatened to run a massive coordinated media smear campaign, framing me as a predatory, corrupt slumlord who manipulated contracts to abuse his own family and steal from his white daughter-in-law. He promised to ensure my logistics warehouses were targeted by endless city inspections and aggressive zoning violations until my entire commercial real estate empire crumbled into dust. They stood there utterly convinced that their white elite privilege gave them the absolute power to crush my business and dictate my actions. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to defend myself against their pathetic racist threats. I simply looked at them, letting their arrogant shouting fill the room until they finally ran out of breath. I leaned back in my leather chair, picked up a small remote control from my desk drawer, and pressed a single button. The motorized blinds on my office windows seamlessly lowered, plunging the room into darkness. A massive high-definition projector screen descended silently from the ceiling directly behind my desk. I looked at Thomas and Victoria, my voice dead calm. I explained to them that when my attorney, Oliver Price, conducts a deep-dive forensic financial investigation, he does not just stop at the immediate target. He follows the money all the way up the family tree. I pressed a second button on the remote, and the high-powered projector illuminated the dark room, casting a stark, blinding light directly onto their horrified faces. The massive screen displayed a highly classified, heavily encrypted digital dossier that Oliver's private investigator had meticulously unearthed from the darkest corners of the international banking system. The very first document projected onto the wall was a detailed, undeniable map of Thomas and Victoria's offshore financial network. They were not old money aristocrats. They were generational frauds. The screen clearly highlighted 3 separate heavily concealed shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands holding over $4 million in undeclared assets. I systematically clicked through the slides presenting a masterclass in federal tax evasion. The documents showed that for the past 12 years, Thomas had been actively funneling millions of dollars of undeclared commercial income through these fictitious foreign entities to avoid paying capital gains and domestic income taxes. Victoria had been illegally writing off their lavish European vacations, their luxury vehicles, and their high-end country club memberships as fraudulent corporate losses, billing them as fake consulting fees. They had built their entire aristocratic upper-class facade on a foundation of aggressive, systematic felonies. I stared at them, watching the arrogant superior sneers completely melt off their faces, replaced instantly by the pale, suffocating terror of trapped criminals. I projected their most recent filed tax returns right next to the secret offshore routing numbers, highlighting a multi-million-dollar discrepancy that would make any federal auditor salivate. I told Thomas that his pristine family legacy was nothing but a fragile house of cards held together by wire fraud and tax evasion. I explained that while he was busy threatening to call local journalists to complain about a canceled credit card, I was holding enough hard, undeniable digital evidence to secure both of them a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The power dynamic in the room inverted so violently it practically sucked the oxygen from the air. Victoria grabbed the edge of my desk to steady herself, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she stared at the glowing screen. Her threatening posture vanished entirely. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed, staring at the exact bank account numbers he believed were shielded by impenetrable international privacy laws. They had marched into my office expecting to bully a subordinate working-class man. Instead, they had walked directly into a financial slaughterhouse, completely outmatched and utterly exposed. I picked up my cell phone and placed it flat on the desk between us. I calmly informed them that the screen currently displayed the direct personal email address of the lead investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. I reached over and pressed a sleek digital timer on my desk console. The bright red numbers began counting down from exactly 60 seconds. I looked Thomas dead in the eye and delivered my final, non-negotiable ultimatum. I told him he and his wife had exactly 1 minute to turn around, walk out of my building, and permanently sever all ties with my granddaughter and my son. If they ever threatened me again, or if they ever tried to contact Lily, I would hit send and completely obliterate their entire existence. The timer hit 50 seconds. Thomas did not utter a single word of protest. He grabbed his wife by the arm, and the 2 elite, arrogant aristocrats practically sprinted out of my office in sheer, unadulterated terror. Victoria stumbled in her expensive designer heels as they fled my property like cowards escaping a burning building, the frantic sound of their footsteps echoing down the hallway. The heavy glass doors of my executive suite had barely closed behind Courtney's terrified parents when I received the notification from my security team. I instructed them to lock down the commercial headquarters and drove my battered Ford pickup back to the south side. The winter sky had darkened into a deep, freezing black, and the snow was falling heavily, burying the cracked sidewalks of my neighborhood. As I pulled into my driveway, my headlights swept across a pathetic, shivering figure huddled on my front porch. It was Aaron. He was not wearing his arrogant corporate sneer or projecting the untouchable confidence of a financial executive. He was completely stripped of his armor. His expensive tailored cashmere coat was soaked through with freezing slush, and his designer shoes were ruined by the salt and ice. When I stepped out of the truck and walked up the concrete path, he did not stand up to greet me. He simply crumbled. Aaron fell entirely to his knees right there on the frozen wood of my porch. The sheer weight of his catastrophic failures had finally crushed his spine. He buried his face in his freezing hands and began to weep with the ragged, heavy sobs of a man who knew his life was officially over. He did not try to hide his disgrace. Between violent gasps for cold air, the truth poured out of him like a ruptured dam. He confessed to everything. He admitted to the massive corporate embezzlement, detailing how he illegally wired hundreds of thousands of dollars to a dummy corporation. He told me about the catastrophic private equity loan he signed with Apex Holdings, completely unaware that he had pledged his remaining life straight into my hands. He sobbed that corporate security had escorted him out of his own building, that he was suspended without pay, and that federal investigators were actively preparing his arrest warrant. He was staring directly into the abyss of a 10-year federal prison sentence, and he was absolutely terrified. I unlocked the front door and dragged him inside by the collar of his ruined coat, throwing him into a chair at my kitchen table. The warmth of the house did nothing to stop his violent shaking. Aaron immediately launched into a frantic, desperate defense, desperately trying to shift the blame for his monumental crimes. He pointed his finger squarely at his wife. He sobbed that Courtney was a relentless, bottomless pit of financial demands. He claimed she constantly threatened to divorce him and take Lily away if he could not provide the aristocratic, elite lifestyle she demanded. He painted a picture of immense, suffocating societal pressure, crying that he was just trying to keep his family together in a neighborhood of ruthless billionaires. He blamed the country club fees, the private school expectations, and the sheer terror of being exposed as a fraud among his wealthy white peers. He desperately wanted me to see him as a tragic victim of circumstance, a good man pushed to the absolute brink by a toxic, demanding spouse. I stood across the table, my expression carved from pure stone. I absolutely refused to indulge his pathetic victim complex. I slammed my hand down on the oak table, silencing his whimpering immediately. I systematically dismantled his entire defense, tearing down his fragile ego piece by piece. I told Aaron that Courtney did not forge his signature on those corporate ledgers. Courtney did not force him to bypass his own company's security protocols. I reminded him that he actively chose to marry a parasite because he was deeply ashamed of his own roots. He hated being the son of a working-class black man from the South Side, so he bought his way into a world that fundamentally despised him. His embezzlement was not an act of love for his family. It was an act of pure cowardly vanity. He stole because his fragile pride could not handle the humiliation of downsizing. I looked at the man I had raised and told him he had traded his integrity for a leased Porsche and a fake smile. He was not a victim. He was a weak, deeply insecure man who chose to become a federal criminal rather than admit he was broke. Aaron sat completely paralyzed, the brutal, unvarnished truth stripping away his last remaining shreds of dignity. He knew every single word I said was entirely accurate. He lowered his head, staring at the wood grain of the table, bracing himself for me to kick him out into the freezing night and let the federal authorities consume his life. Instead, I walked over to the heavy iron safe secured in the corner of my living room. I spun the dial, pulled open the heavy steel door, and extracted a thick, sealed manila folder Oliver Price had delivered to my house earlier that afternoon. I walked back into the kitchen and dropped the heavy folder directly in front of Aaron. He flinched, terrified of what new legal nightmare I was about to unleash upon him. I instructed him to open it. With trembling, frostbitten fingers, Aaron peeled back the flap. He pulled out the first document, his red, swollen eyes scanning the official bank watermarks. It was a certified, heavily verified cashier's check drawn directly from my primary commercial holding account. The payee line was left blank, ready to be assigned directly to the corporate entity Aaron had defrauded. The exact amount printed in bold black ink was $500,000. Aaron gasped, the air rushing out of his lungs as if he had been physically struck. It was a sum of money large enough to completely replace the embezzled corporate funds, aggressively pay off the exorbitant compliance penalties, and entirely erase the financial deficit before the federal investigators could secure a grand jury indictment. It was absolute unconditional salvation printed on a single slip of paper. Aaron stared at the check, a fresh wave of tears flooding his eyes. He reached out to touch the paper, practically worshiping the financial miracle sitting in front of him. He looked up at me, his voice cracking with sheer disbelief and desperate gratitude. He thanked me profusely, swearing that he would spend the rest of his natural life repaying every single cent, promising that he would completely change his ways. He genuinely believed that a father's unconditional love had just triumphed over his monumental betrayal. But I quickly raised my hand, stopping his pathetic display of gratitude dead in its tracks. I told him that he did not understand the nature of my business. I do not issue charity, and I absolutely do not finance sinking ships. I informed him that the $500,000 check was not a gift. It was a highly calculated transaction, and the cost of this transaction was his absolute compliance. I reached into the manila folder and pulled out the second document, sliding it deliberately across the table until it rested directly on top of the life-saving cashier's check. Aaron looked down, the color instantly draining from his face as he read the bold legal heading. It was a comprehensive, legally binding, aggressively drafted set of divorce papers. The terms were completely ruthless, stripping Courtney of any claim to future assets and granting Aaron full primary custody of Lily based on Courtney's documented infidelity and financial fraud. I leaned over the table, my voice dropping to a cold, unforgiving register. I told him I would never allow a single dime of my empire to benefit the vile, racist woman who tried to destroy him. I pointed to the heavy silver pen resting on the table and delivered my absolute, non-negotiable ultimatum. You either sign this document right now and sever that parasite from your life forever, or you walk out my front door and go to federal prison. Choose. Aaron did not hesitate. The sheer terror of a federal prison sentence completely overrode whatever pathetic, lingering affection he still harbored for his toxic wife. He grabbed the heavy silver pen and signed the divorce documents with a violently shaking hand, sealing the end of his marriage to secure his freedom. I allowed him to sleep on the sofa in my den, a broken man seeking sanctuary from the wreckage of his own life. The next morning, I instructed my private security team to deliver the signed divorce petition directly to the suburban mansion. Courtney was standing in the middle of her freezing empty foyer, furiously dialing the numbers of elite divorce attorneys she could no longer afford to retain. When my security guard handed her the thick legal packet, she did not break down in tears. She did not mourn the sudden collapse of her decade-long marriage or the destruction of her family unit. The moment her manicured fingers tore open the envelope and she read the bold legal heading, a sickening, predatory gleam illuminated her eyes. She did not see a tragic end. She saw a lucrative exit strategy. The panic of the repossession and the sheer terror of impending poverty instantly vanished, completely replaced by pure, unadulterated greed. She realized that Aaron signing the divorce papers meant I was actively trying to cleanly sever the legal ties between our families. In her twisted, opportunistic mind, she believed I was desperate to protect my vast, newly discovered commercial empire from a messy, public legal battle. She looked at the signature on the page and smiled a dark, triumphant smile. She believed she had just been handed the ultimate leverage. Courtney did not even attempt to contact her husband. She knew Aaron was completely powerless, a suspended broke executive with absolutely zero leverage. She understood that if she wanted a massive payout, she had to negotiate directly with the actual bank. Less than an hour after receiving the papers, she bypassed Aaron entirely and marched straight into the lobby of my commercial logistics headquarters. She completely ignored the receptionist, aggressively pushing her way into my private executive suite with the supreme arrogance of a corporate raider arriving for a hostile takeover. She slammed the divorce petition onto my polished walnut desk, crossing her arms and glaring at me with absolute defiance. Courtney had always treated her marriage not as a partnership of love, but as a strategic, highly calculated financial merger. To her, Aaron was simply an investment vehicle that had severely underperformed and eventually crashed, now that the merger was officially dissolving. She was aggressively demanding her golden parachute. She practically sneered as she paced across my office, bragging about how much she knew regarding my secret wealth and the massive scale of my commercial real estate holdings. She explicitly stated that she was legally entitled to half of everything Aaron stood to inherit. She conveniently ignored the fact that Aaron owned absolutely nothing, that his bank accounts were entirely drained. and that he was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of high-interest debt. In her deeply delusional reality, the rules of basic finance did not apply to her. She believed her mere proximity to my wealth guaranteed her a massive severance package. She loudly declared that she would drag out the divorce proceedings for years, relentlessly dragging my name and my businesses through the mud in open court, creating a spectacular media circus that would humiliate my entire family. She was utterly convinced that a wealthy private black man like myself would gladly pay a premium just to make a loud, aggressive white suburban problem quietly disappear. She leaned over my desk, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernails against the glass surface. She reminded me of her affluent social circle threatening to leverage her parents' remaining political connections to ensure every judge in the district saw me as a controlling, financially abusive patriarch. She viewed herself as a sophisticated negotiator cornering a novice completely blind to the reality that she was sprinting headfirst into a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. She did not realize that I had anticipated this exact reaction from the moment I printed the divorce petition. I sat back in my leather executive chair, keeping my expression entirely void of any emotion. I told Courtney to stop wasting my time with theatrical threats and name her exact price. She smiled a cold, shark-like grin and delivered her extortion demand. She demanded a cashier check for $1 million, completely tax-free. In exchange for the 7-figure payout, she promised to sign the divorce papers, immediately surrender full primary custody of Lily to Aaron without a fight, and walk away quietly without ever speaking to the press or challenging the prenuptial clauses. I did not blink at the exorbitant number. I simply asked her what would happen if I refused to pay her a single dime. Courtney's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, concentrated malice. She leaned across the desk, her voice dropping to a vicious, threatening whisper. She told me she knew exactly why Aaron was hiding at my house. She revealed that before she fled the mansion. She had snooped through Aaron's home office and found the frantic, undeniable paper trail of his corporate embezzlement. She knew he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from his employer. She looked me dead in the eye and explicitly threatened to walk straight into the local FBI field office and hand them the physical evidence of Aaron's federal crimes if I did not instantly agree to her $1 million demand. She was aggressively weaponizing her own husband's impending incarceration to extort his father. It was the absolute pinnacle of betrayal. I looked at her, evaluating the sheer depth of her moral bankruptcy. She was eagerly willing to send the father of her child to a federal penitentiary for a decade just to secure a cash payout. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a heavily drafted legal settlement agreement Oliver Price had prepared, and slid it across the table. I grabbed my heavy silver pen and signed my name on the bottom line, authorizing the $1 million transfer. Courtney let out a sharp, victorious laugh, snatching the document and signing her own name with triumphant aggression. She genuinely believed she had just conquered the billionaire. She folded the signed agreement and shoved it into her designer handbag, her chest heaving with the thrill of her perceived victory. She looked down at me, her eyes flashing with absolute superiority. She mocked me, stating that I might have built a vast logistics empire, but I was clearly too weak to protect my pathetic son without opening my wallet. She confidently declared that she had won the war, proving once and for all that she was the smartest person in the room. I remained completely silent, my hands folded neatly on my desk. I watched her revel in her extortion, letting her soak in the absolute peak of her false triumph. Courtney turned on her heel, her designer boots clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she marched toward the exit, eager to cash her $1 million extortion check. Before her hand could even touch the brass handle of the heavy glass door, I pressed a small, discreet button hidden under the lip of my desk. The electronic lock on the door to the adjoining private conference room clicked loudly. The heavy wooden door swung open slowly. Aaron stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the executive suite. He was pale, his eyes completely hollow, his face entirely devoid of color. He had been standing silently in the adjacent room the entire time. He had heard every single word. He had listened with crystal-clear precision as his wife, the woman he had destroyed his life and risked federal prison to please, eagerly sold his freedom, his future, and his very life for a piece of paper. Courtney froze in her tracks, the triumphant color instantly draining from her face. The brutal revelation in my office did not shame Courtney into submission. Her absolute lack of a moral compass allowed her to compartmentalize her husband's shattered expression and focus entirely on the massive payout she believed she had secured. Exactly 48 hours later, the heavy oak doors of the Cook County Family Court swung open. I walked into the austere, wood-paneled courtroom with Oliver Price right by my side. Aaron walked closely behind us, his head bowed, looking like a man marching toward his own execution. He took a seat at the respondent table, utterly silent and emotionally hollowed out. Across the aisle, Courtney sat radiating a sickening, triumphant energy. She was flanked by Victor Vance, the sleazy, unethical attorney who had orchestrated the fraudulent medical evaluation. Courtney clutched her designer handbag tightly against her chest, treating it like a vault. Inside rested the signed settlement agreement and what she fully believed was a valid $1 million cashier's check. She actually shot me a smug, venomous smirk across the room, completely convinced she was about to walk out of this courthouse a wealthy, untouchable woman. The Honorable Judge Harper entered the room, his stern face scanning the documents laid out before him. Victor Vance immediately stood up, buttoning his cheap suit jacket. He aggressively approached the bench, handing the judge the emergency conservatorship petition. Vance spoke with supreme, unearned confidence, loudly declaring that they had secured an undeniable official psychiatric evaluation proving my severe cognitive decline. He smugly demanded the court immediately freeze my vast commercial assets and appoint Aaron as the legal guardian, setting the stage for Courtney to quietly loot the estate during the divorce. She sat up straight, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. I did not wait for the judge to review the fraudulent medical paperwork. I stood up from my chair, my posture radiating absolute, unwavering authority. Oliver Price stepped forward simultaneously, formally objecting to the entire proceeding. He loudly informed the court that the medical evaluation Victor Vance had just submitted was a completely fabricated, highly illegal document procured through aggressive financial bribery. Victor scoffed loudly, waving his hands and accusing Oliver of making desperate, baseless slander against a respected medical professional. The judge frowned deeply, demanding immediate proof of such a severe allegation. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted digital audio player. I placed it firmly on the defense table and pressed play. The crystal-clear, high-definition audio I had secretly recorded from beneath my living room coffee table echoed loudly through the silent, cavernous courtroom. Everyone in the room heard the unmistakable, condescending voice of Dr. Evans. They listened as he explicitly admitted to accepting a massive bribe from Courtney. They heard him proudly announce his intention to falsify a severe dementia diagnosis without conducting a single valid cognitive test. They heard him explicitly state that he was doing this so Courtney could seize my estate. The sheer, undeniable malice captured on the recording was absolutely devastating. The judge's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He slammed his gavel down with tremendous force, completely silencing Victor Vance's pathetic, stammering attempts to defend the indefensible audio. The judge looked directly at Courtney with pure, unadulterated disgust. He realized instantly that she had aggressively weaponized the medical and legal systems to execute a hostile financial takeover against a perfectly sane, highly capable man. Judge Harper did not hesitate for a single second. He aggressively ripped the emergency conservatorship petition in half and threw the pieces aside. He officially threw the case out furiously, stating that he would be forwarding the audio recording directly to the Medical Licensing Board to ensure Dr. Evans never practiced medicine again. He then pointed a furious finger at Victor Vance, threatening him with immediate disbarment and a criminal investigation for his role in the conspiracy. Courtney's primary weapon, the legal mechanism she intended to use to hold my empire hostage, was instantly and brutally obliterated. Courtney panicked, her eyes darting frantically around the courtroom as her master plan collapsed in real time. But her deep-seated greed refused to let her accept total defeat. She aggressively stood up, shoving her chair back, and reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out the divorce settlement agreement I had signed in my office. She loudly declared to the judge that the conservatorship did not matter anymore because she possessed a legally binding contract guaranteeing her a $1 million payout to walk away from the marriage. She waved the paper in the air, demanding her money with the hysterical entitlement of a cornered predator. Oliver Price calmly adjusted his tie and approached the bench with a secondary, incredibly thick stack of financial documents. He informed the judge that the financial landscape of this divorce had drastically shifted over the past 48 hours. Oliver presented the official loan default notices from Apex Holdings. He explained that Aaron had taken out a predatory high-interest loan to cover his corporate embezzlement using his final unvested stock options and bank accounts as collateral. Since Aaron had been suspended and defaulted on the payment terms, Apex Holdings had fully activated its collateral claim. Every single asset tied to Aaron Carmichael had been legally aggressively seized. Oliver then turned his icy gaze directly onto Courtney. He pointed out a standard non-negotiable legal clause buried deep within the fine print of that exact private equity loan. Because Courtney was legally married to Aaron and had co-signed previous financial liabilities, any active fraud or default on those accounts immediately voided subsequent financial settlements during active divorce proceedings. Furthermore, Oliver handed the judge a bank confirmation showing that I had explicitly placed a hard stop payment on the $1 million cashier's check due to documented aggressive extortion. The piece of paper Courtney was frantically waving in the air was completely worthless. It was nothing but a voided dead contract. She had surrendered her primary custody rights and signed the divorce papers in exchange for absolutely $0 and 0 cents. Her golden parachute had just been violently ripped away mid-flight. She was left standing in the center of the courtroom with zero legal leverage, zero access to my wealth, and an incredibly agitated judge watching her total psychological meltdown. Completely stripped of her power, her wealth, and her aristocratic illusion, Courtney completely lost her mind. She turned her furious, manic gaze toward Aaron, her face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at his chest and screamed at the top of her lungs, declaring that she was walking straight from this courtroom to the local FBI field office. She loudly vowed to report his corporate embezzlement, swearing she would personally ensure he rotted in a federal penitentiary for the next decade. I simply smiled a cold, calculating expression and looked directly toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The doors swung open violently. 2 heavily armed, uniformed police officers marched directly down the center aisle, their boots echoing loudly against the polished floor. They bypassed Aaron entirely, marching straight up to the plaintiff's table. They stopped right in front of Courtney, pulling out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. They loudly announced they possessed a federal warrant for her immediate arrest for aggressive wire fraud and multiple counts of identity theft stemming from her predatory payday loans. The cold metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the silent courtroom was the absolute final nail in Courtney's gilded coffin. The 2 federal officers aggressively secured her wrists behind her back, ignoring her frantic, hysterical thrashing. The arrogant, untouchable suburban aristocrat completely shattered in an instant. She violently resisted, kicking her designer heels against the polished wooden floor, screaming vile, unfiltered obscenities that bounced off the high vaulted ceilings. She shrieked that she was a wealthy, respected woman, demanding they arrest me and Aaron instead, furiously declaring that she was the victim of a massive, coordinated conspiracy. The judge watched with absolute disgust, hammering his gavel and ordering the officers to remove her from his courtroom immediately. They grabbed her by the arms and physically dragged her down the center aisle. Her manicured nails scraped against the heavy oak doors as they forced her out into the hallway. Her piercing screams slowly fading into the distance until there was nothing left but a heavy, suffocating silence. Aaron stood completely paralyzed at the respondent table. He did not move a single muscle to defend his wife. He did not call out her name. He simply stared blankly at the empty space where she had been standing just moments before. In the span of a single hour, his entire reality had been violently dismantled. His toxic marriage was legally severed, his financial facade was obliterated, and the woman he had destroyed his life to please was on her way to a federal holding cell. He was left standing in the center of the courtroom with absolutely nothing. He had no money, no home, no prestige, and no family left to manipulate. He looked at me with hollow, defeated eyes, realizing the absolute totality of his ruin. Later that same afternoon, I sat across from the board of directors at Aaron's former corporate logistics firm. I did not go there to beg for mercy or to excuse my son's catastrophic moral failures. I went there to execute a sterile, calculated business transaction. I placed the cashier's check for $500,000 directly onto the center of their boardroom table. The funds completely covered the massive crater of missing capital Aaron had illegally wired to his dummy corporation, along with a substantial additional sum to cover all internal audit fees and compliance penalties. I explicitly told the board that I was not paying this money to protect a thief. I was paying it to permanently close the ledger and shield my own commercial reputation from the fallout of his federal indictment. The corporation, eager to avoid a messy, highly public scandal that would undoubtedly terrify their shareholders, accepted the immediate financial restitution. They officially agreed to drop all pending federal criminal charges against Aaron, quietly sweeping the massive embezzlement completely under the rug. I had successfully saved my son from a devastating 10-year prison sentence, but I did not save his life. I completely dismantled it. Aaron was officially permanently terminated from the company with extreme prejudice. He was legally stripped of his executive title, his comprehensive benefits package, and any remaining vested stock options. Furthermore, the eviction from the $3 million suburban mansion was carried out with brutal efficiency. My security team oversaw the removal of Aaron's personal belongings, boxing up his expensive tailored suits and designer watches, dumping them unceremoniously onto the icy pavement. The sprawling limestone estate was immediately locked down and prepped to be sold. The illusion of his corporate superiority was entirely dead. He was no longer a respected financial director rubbing elbows with wealthy elites at the country club. He was a broke, unemployed, disgraced man with an absolutely toxic professional reputation that ensured he would never work in the corporate financial sector again. I had systematically removed every single crutch, every fake accolade, and every unearned privilege he had spent his entire adult life desperately clinging to. I reduced him to an absolute blank slate, forcing him to stand naked before the crushing reality of his own colossal failures. There would be no more bailouts, no more hidden safety nets, and absolutely zero tolerance for his arrogance. I drove my battered Ford pickup truck directly to the curb where Aaron was standing next to his meager cardboard boxes. I did not offer a warm, comforting smile. I simply unlocked the passenger door and told him to get in. We drove in heavy, absolute silence away from the wealthy northern suburbs and deep into the gritty, industrial heart of the South Side. I pulled up to the massive, sprawling complex of my primary commercial logistics warehouse. The deafening roar of diesel engines reversing 18-wheelers and shouting dock workers filled the freezing air. This was the exact gritty, blue-collar environment Aaron had spent his entire life running away from. This was the world he was deeply ashamed of, the foundation of sweat and heavy lifting that had actually funded his fake aristocratic lifestyle. I parked the truck and ordered him to follow me inside. We walked past the towering pallets of freight, navigating through the harsh fluorescent lights and the freezing concrete floors. I led him into a small, sparsely furnished supervisor's office located right on the active loading dock. I did not offer him a comfortable chair. I opened a metal filing cabinet, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slammed it down onto the metal desk. It was a standard entry-level employment contract for a third-shift sanitation worker. The pay rate was explicitly listed at the absolute legal minimum wage. The hours were brutal, requiring heavy, physically exhausting labor from midnight until 8 in the morning. I looked Aaron dead in the eye and delivered his final reality check. I told him that I had paid off his corporate debt to keep him out of a federal penitentiary, but that money was a loan, not a gift. I informed him that he owed me $500,000 and he was going to pay back every single cent through brutal, relentless physical labor. I pointed to a heavy industrial mop and a yellow plastic bucket resting in the corner of the office. I told him he would clean the massive warehouse floors, scrub the employee restrooms, and clear the loading docks of grease and debris. He would receive no special treatment, no executive privileges, and absolutely zero respect until he earned it with his own 2 hands. I slid a cheap plastic pen across the metal desk. I told him to sign the contract and pick up the mop or walk out the door and figure out how to survive on the freezing streets with nothing but the clothes on his back. Aaron stood trembling in the harsh, fluorescent light of the warehouse office. He stared down at the minimum wage contract, the arrogant corporate financial director officially dead and buried. He looked at the heavy industrial mop resting in the corner, a symbol of the grueling blue-collar labor he had spent his entire life actively despising. There was no Courtney to blame, no fake elite status to hide behind, and no magical financial bailout waiting in the wings. He slowly reached across the cold metal desk and picked up the cheap plastic pen. With a shaking hand, he signed his name on the bottom line, legally binding himself to the brutal reality of his new existence. He walked over to the corner, his expensive ruined dress shoes scraping against the concrete, and gripped the wooden handle of the mop. He lifted it, feeling the rough, splintered wood against his soft, uncalloused palms. For the first time in his 38 years, my son felt the heavy, undeniable weight of real, honest labor. The harsh fluorescent lights of the commercial loading dock faded from my mind as I sat comfortably in my worn leather armchair. It was Christmas Eve. Exactly 1 full year had passed since the moment my cell phone lit up with that disrespectful, cowardly text message demanding space. The brutal, freezing winds of Chicago howled outside the thick glass windows of my humble South Side home. But inside, the atmosphere was entirely different. A fire was crackling fiercely in the brick hearth, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet living room. The scent of sweet potato pie and roasted cinnamon filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, cold environment of the corporate world I dominated. I held a glass of aged bourbon in my hand, feeling the gentle heat spread through my chest as I stared into the dancing orange flames. Last Christmas, I had sat in this exact same spot, enveloped in the heavy, suffocating silence of rejection. I had spent that night systematically dismantling the financial empire of a deeply ungrateful family. Tonight, there was no anger burning in my veins. There were no aggressive legal contracts waiting to be signed and no offshore bank accounts needing to be frozen. The absolute financial slaughter I had orchestrated was completely finished. The dust had finally settled. The sprawling suburban limestone mansion had been sold to a lovely young family who actually appreciated its value. The luxury vehicles had been auctioned off by the creditors. The fake aristocratic facade had been completely eradicated from the earth. I took a slow sip of my drink, savoring the absolute, undeniable peace that now reigned in my house. The space they had so desperately demanded from me had ultimately been the catalyst for their total destruction. But from those bitter ashes, a brand new reality had been meticulously forged. The wooden staircase creaked softly, pulling me from my deep reflection. My 16-year-old granddaughter Lily walked slowly down the steps. She was not wearing the exorbitant $1,000 designer silk pajamas her mother used to buy for her just to post pictures on social media. She wore a simple oversized flannel shirt and thick wool socks. In her hands, she carried 2 large steaming ceramic mugs of hot cocoa, completely overflowing with melted marshmallows. She walked over and handed me a mug with a bright, genuine smile, taking a seat on the woven rug directly in front of the warm fireplace. When the dust of the legal apocalypse had finally settled, Lily was given a choice by the family court. She could have easily entered the foster system or sought emancipation given the catastrophic ruin of both her parents. Instead, she looked the judge dead in the eye and stated she only wanted to live on the South Side with her grandfather. Over the past 12 months, the transformation in this young woman was nothing short of miraculous. Without the toxic, suffocating influence of her mother constantly forcing her to perform for elite white society, Lily had finally found her true identity. I did not spoil her. I refused to repeat the fatal mistakes I had made with her father. When she moved into my modest brick house, I established strict non-negotiable rules. I required her to get a part-time job at a local neighborhood grocery store after school. She learned how to mop floors, stock shelves, and interact with hard-working, blue-collar people who did not care about designer labels or country club memberships. She learned the actual tangible value of a hard-earned dollar. She opened her own modest savings account and managed her own budget. The deep-seated racial shame and the vicious microaggressions her mother had brainwashed her with completely vanished. Lily embraced her heritage, volunteering at community centers right here in the neighborhood her mother had so aggressively despised. She became grounded, respectful, and fiercely independent. The $200,000 irrevocable trust fund I had established for her education sat safely in the bank, growing silently, completely untouchable until her 25th birthday. She knew the money was there, but she also knew she had to build her own foundation first. She took a sip of her hot cocoa and leaned her head against my knee, the simple, quiet affection speaking volumes. I gently patted my granddaughter's shoulder, my mind drifting to the other soul I had forcefully ripped from the wreckage. I thought about Aaron. For the first 6 months at the logistics warehouse, my son had been entirely fueled by bitter resentment and sheer physical exhaustion. Stripped of his executive title and his tailored suits, he struggled immensely to adapt to the grueling reality of third-shift sanitation. He came home every single morning with blistered hands, an aching back, and a bruised ego. He scrubbed heavy grease off the loading docks and cleaned the industrial bathrooms, surrounded by tough working-class men who did not care that he used to be a corporate financial director. They only cared if he pulled his own weight. I never offered him a word of pity. I never gave him a single day off. But slowly the grueling labor began to strip away the arrogant, entitled poison that had infected his mind for a decade. He stopped complaining about the smell of diesel fuel. He stopped acting superior to the forklift drivers. He started arriving to his shifts early, working in total silence, earning the grudging respect of his blue-collar supervisors. He was paying back the $500,000 embezzlement debt penny by agonizing penny, and in the process, he was finally becoming a man. Yesterday, his shift manager called me to report that Aaron had actively intervened to fix a major scheduling error on the loading dock, using his sharp logistical mind to save the warehouse from a massive shipping delay. The manager actually recommended him for a minor promotion to a desk clerk position. I approved it. It was a tiny step, but it was a step he had earned entirely on his own merit. I looked into the crackling fire, reflecting on the absolute devastation of the past year. I had completely incinerated my son's comfortable life. I had orchestrated the public arrest and federal incarceration of my own daughter-in-law. I had seized their assets, destroyed their social standing, and forcefully dragged them down into the gritty reality of the working class. To an outsider, my actions might have looked like the work of a vindictive, tyrannical monster. But looking at Lily sitting peacefully by the fire and knowing Aaron was currently working an honest shift, without the threat of federal prison hanging over his head, I knew the absolute truth. I had to utterly destroy their fabricated toxic world in order to save their souls. I took the final sip of my bourbon, setting the crystal glass on the wooden side table. I stood up and walked slowly toward the front window, pulling back the thick curtain to look out at the freezing Chicago night. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing the south side streets in a pristine, unbroken layer of pure white. The harsh winter wind howled against the glass, a brutal force of nature demanding absolute respect. I watched the streetlights flicker in the storm. I realized then that genuine parental love is not always warm or gentle. It is not about providing endless financial safety nets or shielding your family from the consequences of their own arrogance. Sometimes the greatest, most profound act of love a father can possibly provide is the ruthless, unvarnished truth. It is the willingness to let them shatter and the discipline to hand them the broom to sweep up their own mess. The fire crackled brightly behind me, casting steady shadows across the room. The debt was paid. The lesson was learned. The storm was finally over. Looking back at everything, the ultimate lesson is that wealth without character is simply a magnifying glass for our deepest flaws. Money should never be used to insulate our loved ones from the severe consequences of their own actions. When we constantly buy them out of their mistakes, we do not protect them. We actively corrupt them and strip away their resilience. True empowerment does not come from a blank check or a cleared debt. It comes from having the absolute courage to let them fall, handing them the broom to sweep up their own mess, and teaching them how to finally stand on their own 2 feet. If you have ever had to make a difficult choice to save a family member from their own toxic behavior, share your experience in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more stories of truth and redemption.